Library Board at 10 a.m. I'd like to welcome everybody, and our board has several new members, so I think we'll just start and let everyone introduce themselves. We'll start down here with Bob.
Okay, I'm Bob Johnson, and I am from Hanover, and it's my first time on the board.
Barbara Sloan, Goochland, my first time on the board.
Joe O'Connor, Hanover County, and I'm a veteran of the board.
Mary Shipman, King William County, and I've been on the board for 2 years.
Tricia Simpkins from King and Queen County, and I've been on the board several years.
Ryan Martin, Hanover County, about a year, not quite a year, but almost a year.
John Edwards, King William County, and I've been on the board for about a year.
Christy Schumacher, Hanover County, and I'm also new to the board.
I'm Barb Young. I'm from Goochland County, and I've been on the board for 3 years.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome everyone. Are there any amendments to the agenda for today?
I would like to ask a question.
Okay.
When I was going through the agenda, or this agenda, and then trying to go back through our bylaws, I could not quite understand what kind of a meeting this is today. Is it a special meeting, or is it a?
No,
meeting
this
of
is
the board?
this is a regular board meeting.
Okay. And it's not following exactly the outline of the one that's in bylaws.
How does it vary?
Well, so it is not strictly following what is in the bylaws. This is a relatively unique meeting for us because we have 3 people who have never served. So we're doing orientation. The existing board members have made it a focus to do more board development, board training, and it seems with that need for additional training for the regular board and orientation, that it was going to be best to go ahead and start this year, this new fiscal year, with a session and go over everything for everybody all at once, get everybody off to a good start, have a solid foundation under them to help them do their jobs this year.
I have a question. Calling it a work session, does that impede any of the things we're allowed to do during this meeting?
No.
Is it considered a regular board meeting, just called a work session? So what is the difference between a work session and a board meeting, if I can ask as the newbie?
Yeah, that's what I can't get to. And particularly when it says that there is no time, right, for the citizen. So that to me really, I'm struggling with that.
Again, based on how much time there is to get business done, having it as a work session and not having citizens' time today was noted from the beginning. The public has known that as long as the agenda has been out in terms of that speaking opportunity. Customers are always welcome to contact the library, email, letters, phone calls, etc. But it takes a significant amount of time these days to go through with citizens' time, and it's an effort of making the Board of Trustees meeting really work for the board.
I have a question. When did the board decide to make it a work session versus a regular meeting?
I've worked with the chair and
That wasn't
the nominated
That
chair.
wasn't a full board decision?
It was not.
And so what I'm seeing is members of the board are coming into a meeting, they don't know what the structure of the meeting is, and that seems a little off to me. Just as a new person looking in, board members are asking, what are we supposed to do at this meeting? And it seems like the board should have been the one directing what the meeting was going to be. That's just my take on it.
Well, the chair, existing chair, and the person nominated for chair for this fiscal year, both were in those discussions.
Okay, just seems a lapse of communication to the other board members, from what I can see, but.
I think
If I may.
Yeah, I was thinking, okay.
If I may, Madam Chair,
Yeah.
for those on the library board and for those in the public, my name is Dennis Swalter. I'm the Hanover County Attorney. My office and I serve as counsel to the board, and my goal here right now is just to talk a little bit about the parliamentary stuff. I'm going to talk, my presentation would include some of this. I understand for folks who are new to a board, the concept of how we schedule meetings and how the agenda is set is sometimes a little confusing. Normally what happens is that the chief administrative officer works with the board chair to develop a proposed agenda. The bylaws sort of govern how that generally is set up, but there's sometimes that there are deviations from that. It is proposed before you here now. If you have a question about the order on something that's on the agenda, or if there's something that isn't there that you would like to add to that, there's a process for doing that, and that is to actually make a motion to amend the agenda to either remove something that's on there, change something that is on there, or add something that isn't. I think I covered all three of those categories. So for instance, the proposed agenda today does not include a time for citizens' time. There's no legal requirement that you have citizens' time. It is part of the library board's practice to have that where appropriate. As Mr. Sheffley pointed out, one of the questions is, for a meeting like this, which is really intended to be a work session to allow new folks to learn a little bit more about the library board and what you do and how you are an effective library board member, given the amount of time on everybody's schedule, meetings are intended to get work done. And the amount of work that is intended to be done today did not lend itself, in the view of the folks scheduling this, to have an extended amount of citizens' time. If it's the pleasure of the library board as a whole to add some time, that's certainly something that could be discussed. And I'm happy to help if in fact that's what's intended, but just because something is set out in the bylaws does not mean that there needs to be a strict following to that. And if you have a question about what's on here, as you did, that's the appropriate time to ask it. Whether or not you like the explanation that's given to you or not, you can then decide whether you want to change that.
I was just asking for a clarification.
So I hope that's helpful in terms of where we are. I have not attended library board meetings before, but my understanding is usually there is a time for citizens to be involved in the process. And there's a deviation today because this is really intended to try to get as much information to you all so that your future meetings can be as effective, efficient, and productive as possible. I apologize for that taking longer than it should have.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.
Dennison, it's not that unusual that the present chair and the director develop the agenda for every meeting, correct?
That's correct. And to be honest, I've served as counsel to a whole host of different kinds of boards, the Hanover County Planning Commission, the Board of Supervisors, the Social Services Advisory Board. It actually is necessary. You need to have something to use as the template to go forward, and it's a combination of the chair talks with other library board members in this case and sort of says, is there something that we need to have on there, or it's something that was discussed at a prior meeting, to make sure that it's on at an appropriate time, as well as talking with staff to make sure that they're aware of what's going to be talked about so that they can have the materials that are ready, or to say this is a discussion that's going to take up an hour. If we're going to do that, then we may not be able to handle some of these other discussions at this meeting. When might be the most appropriate time to handle that?
Madam Chair, am I allowed to ask Mr. Walter a question? I don't know what the...
Sure.
Okay. Today, you've planned to come and speak on some of these items. Your name is next to one of them, serving as a trustee. Could you tell us what other items you're prepared to speak on today, or are any of these other items things you're planning to address?
You will have a handout in front of you which sort of covered some of the things that I was planning on discussing. It was more on, I'm going to call it the legal and parliamentary side of things. There's lots of other things that are on here that I'm assuming Mr. Shepley and his staff are prepared to talk about, including the finances, the policies, the performance measures. Those are things that are outside my scope of expertise. So I was planning on talking at the beginning about what the library board is and what library board members sort of do and how you do your work. And then I'd be available for questions as the other topics get discussed, in terms of if there are questions about how you deal with finances or how you deal with policies and what's, but primarily it was sort of the overview at the beginning.
So having just received this today, I haven't had a chance to look through it, but can I could imagine you're gonna talk about the regional library agreement, is that in there?
It is, it's part that's in there. I'm happy to just sort of give the overview of it.
Okay.
There are some discussions ongoing among the various governing bodies of the jurisdictions about reviewing that and what to do as part of that review. But certainly, if anyone, these are all public documents. I realize some of you this may be the first time you're seeing them. But I'm happy to talk as little or as much as the library board would like me about those topics.
Okay. And you said we're also welcome to ask questions. I know from discussions I've had with other people on the board that there are some other legal questions. Would we have a time to speak to those during this meeting as well? Do we need to make a motion to?
I would respond to that in two ways, because it's a two-part answer. One of which is to the extent that a question comes up as part of that, I'm happy to give whatever advice I can. The second part is somewhat of it's an attorney-client type of situation, and that is I serve as counsel to the library board. That means that the attorney-client relationship exists. If you ask me a legal question as the board in a public setting, that means that it's not protected by attorney-client.
Mm-hmm.
In diplomatic terms, it's sort of, we want to have a full and frank discussion, and sometimes we need to have a closed session for that to happen. Now, the library board cannot take any action outside of an open meeting. So if it were to decide, hey, we heard that, and I will use a hypothetical that I'm coming up, somebody's talking about suing the library board. What does that mean? Well, that is a good opportunity for us to go into closed session to have those discussions. You can ask a question and say, I'm completely ignorant about X, or I heard Y. What does that mean? And I can give you my legal opinion. If you were to ask me that question in open setting, I probably would say, I can't really answer that question in this setting, but I'm happy to follow up with you individually. So there are some, I'm going to call them legal principle questions that I'm certainly, if somebody were to call me on the phone, I try to give those answers to whoever that is. But if it's sort of, what does this mean for the library board? Are we in danger if we do X? What is the consequence if we do Y? Those are ones that we might have to have a discussion about the best way to have those discussions.
Right. I would like to make a motion to split the board development session after the PRL Board of Trustees bylaws and allow a time of question and answer of just general questions to Mr. Walter. I don't want to leave those to the end because I know that he has other engagements he needs to get to this afternoon. So I'd like to make a motion that we put a break there and then insert a Q&A session about general questions for Mr. Walter.
Okay, the motion is on the floor.
I'll second that.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, after the bylaws,
After PRL trustee bylaws.
we will have a question and answer period.
I realize this is not my time on the agenda. This is still on the consideration of agenda. So if there aren't any additional ones, then if the chair is ready to go to the next topic, I think Mr. Shebley will be introducing the next topic, but I'm the first presenter on that. But I just wanted to know, just because there's been one amendment, I don't know if there's any additional amendments to the agenda.
Madam Chair, I move to modify the agenda. May I insert a modification? Now, is this the time to do it?
This time, we're asking?
Yeah, I move to modify the agenda while our lawyer is present to add to new business electronic meetings and a discussion about the reserve fund.
So you're making a motion,
To modify the agenda while our
Well-
lawyer is present.
this is new, so that what you're considering is really new business?
I believe it is, yeah. Electronic meetings and live streaming meetings and the reserve fund.
Okay, is there a second to this motion?
A second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay,
Madam
we-
Chair, I move adoption of the agenda as amended.
thank you.
Can I add another, and I don't know if we need to do it as a, well, I guess it would be as a motion, but to, on the minutes for the consent agenda, we don't have the May 24th amendments, or May 24th minutes on the consent agenda. And those have not been passed yet.
Okay, so you'd like to add the May
I'd like to
24th?
add those to the consent agenda, yes.
Okay.
And I don't know if it's appropriate to add on to that. There is actually no consent agenda on the agenda. So I'm not sure where that falls in the, yeah, but
There's
it's
a
not in
separate
the
page.
order of
Yeah.
what we're dealing with.
Well, usually we do that after. So we'll have to add the consent agenda.
We do that where after? Sorry.
We'll do it after this, after we get through the amendments to the agenda. Yes, ma'am?
I'd also like to add another question, if we can, about insurance, board insurance. Is that something that's appropriate to be during the,
We can cover that when,
is that something that,
Barb, we can cover that when Dennis is.
well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
Can we
during his
add that to
presentation.
one of the questions for him?
Okay.
I think that might fit within the legal questions and answers, which has
Yeah.
already been
Yep.
part of the,
Okay.
just because I'm trying to keep notes, I just want to make sure I understand. So as I understand, the motion from Ms. Young is to, it's actually in two parts, one of which is to add acceptance of the May 2023 minutes to the consent agenda, and then, as Ms. Schumacher pointed out, then it would be to add adoption of the consent agenda immediately after this. I just want to make sure I understand what it is, as I'm keeping track of it, so.
Okay.
But that would need to be voted
We
on.
just need to vote on this. All in favor?
I will second that motion,
Okay.
right? You need a second before we vote?
Oh,
Yes, okay.
You second your own motion?
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
John's motion.
No, John's motion
My
is,
motion never went anywhere, but it got run over by Barbara, but that's okay.
Go
so I
ahead, John.
can't second, I added an amendment, so maybe I can't second that
I
one.
think Bob had seconded
Okay.
at one point, didn't you?
What's that?
Didn't you second this one at
I
one?
did.
Madam Chair, if I may,
I did second
just
it.
for clarification purposes, I think the motion, and correct me if I'm wrong, the motion is to make the change, to add the item to the consent agenda, and then to add adoption of the consent agenda to the overall agenda.
Right.
I have not heard a second to that, so I don't know if somebody
Okay.
wants to
And
second that motion.
that was my motion, so
Okay.
Christie could second that, yeah.
Okay.
So
I'll second because I haven't said anything.
so it sounds like we have a motion and a second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, now we get to John.
Now I'll make the motion. We adopt the agenda as amended
Second.
and move forward.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, great. We've accepted the amendments to the agenda for today. Now we'll move on to the consent agenda. They're listed, y'all have received a list of those. It should include the draft of the June 28th minutes, the acceptance of the June and July board report, the acceptance of the June and July warrants, and the May 24th.
Madam Chair, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
When we are accepting these documents, what exactly are we doing? Obviously, one of these is a list of invoices that are being paid. Are we just acknowledging that we have seen these invoices and that we're aware of them?
If you have a question about them, you can bring up a question.
But that's all my responsibility as a board member, is to
Right.
acknowledge that I have seen the invoices, and
Mhm.
I acknowledge that. Okay.
Yeah. And if you have a question about why we paid $16 to somebody, you can ask. Or
Okay.
why we paid $502, you can ask those.
And I have the same question for the budget report. When I accept this budget report, am I in any way saying that I'm just agreeing that I've seen it? Is that correct? Okay. The only thing that I haven't seen, of course, now is the May 2023 minutes.
Well, you weren't here then. So if you were.
Yeah, I haven't seen them
recused
either.
from voting, excuse yourself from voting.
Can I ask a question here?
Sure.
Again, I am so new and trying to look at a lot of material, I never saw the January minutes approved.
We did that the last meeting.
I saw them pulled off the consent agenda, but I didn't see them inserted back into an agenda with a motion. I'm not sure whether that's correct or not, but
I believe it's in the minutes, isn't it, that we approved them?
It should be.
Yeah.
If
That's
it's
what I
not, then that's something we should change on the minutes, yes.
I thought it was, we did that at the last,
I
At the
know it was
last
June
pulled
meeting.
off, but I never saw a motion to put it back on the agenda.
Okay, was
When
that
it came
the,
off the consent agenda,
I
it
believe
was
Mr. Johnson may
discussed
be correct.
at
Yeah.
length.
Yeah.
I believe he's correct. They were pulled off because the thought was information had not been provided to Ms. Young that apparently got lost in email that had been provided.
yeah,
And we did not adopt the minutes because the information was not in there.
So
we could,
Add that to the
I guess,
And
add them,
January?
the January ones back too.
Have
Yeah.
we received the amended January ones?
I think I sent the final copy, yes,
Yeah, I remember seeing the form.
which wouldn't have been correct. They should have been still on draft.
Any more questions about our consent agenda?
Just a question on the budget for Tom. Tom, on the income year-to-date, I see zeros for Goochland, Hanover, King, and Queen. Is that correct?
Correct,
Is that,
at the time of the report.
okay.
That's not unusual.
That's normal.
We get quarterly payments.
Okay.
So,
Madam Chair, I have a question. Total income at the end of the fiscal year in June was 6.1 million. Total expenses were 5.5 million. I'm wondering, where does that difference end up?
so I'm going to start with an apology, but there was a method to my madness of not having consent items here and having an opportunity to go through the orientation of information for everybody to answer many of these questions. But I'm happy to take this one. So that is correct. We had more income than we did expenses in the past fiscal year. The two largest categories for those, one of them was a gift of $250,000 from an Ashland customer who wished to support the Ashland branch. And the other one is a periodization piece. We have been applying for and getting federal grants to pay for hotspots. And you have to spend the money and show them that you spent the money and apply for repayment of the money. So by the time you get paid, it takes so long that it's in the next fiscal year. Those are the two largest categories for that. And that money becomes part of the library's reserve fund. And we're going to talk about the reserve fund when we talk about the library's finances later on the agenda.
Okay, thank you.
Are we ready for the question now? All in favor of accepting the consent agendas for June, July, May 24th, and January 29th, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay.
Aye.
You opposed?
Oh, no, he's an aye.
Okay.
I'm sorry, here.
Joe.
I can't hear.
Okay. Now we're gonna go into our board development session. And Dennis Walter is gonna start us out.
I think Mr. Shepley's just
Oh,
going
Mr.
to use the
Okay.
introductory comments.
If you will. Welcome, everybody. I think this can be a really good session for both the library board as well as the citizens that are present as we go over things. This information that we're presenting today, we're going to be adding it to the library's website as reference, so that will help folks in the future as we work through this process. want to welcome Dennis Walter, Hanover County Attorney, for being here with us to talk about sort of many of the foundational pieces that are important for you to know as you're serving on a public board here in the Commonwealth. Obviously, he has additional value to be able to answer questions for us today. So with that, thank you for being here.
Hey, again, Madam Chair, it's good to be before you. Again, my name is Dennis Walter. I'm the county attorney for Hanover County, and as we'll get to in a little while, part of my role is to serve as counsel for the library board. That has been an arrangement that has been in place since 2000, where the county attorney's office in Hanover has provided that support. Just to, whenever I give these little presentations, I always sort of figure out, folks wonder, who am I and why am I here? In addition to my being Hanover County Attorney, I do want to let you know, I do live in Hanover County. This branch is the closest one to my house, and I am a user of the Pamunkey Regional Library. Before I became county attorney in 2019, I had been with the county attorney's office since 2001. So I have been a part of this community and a part of the county attorney's office. Next month will be 22 years. So just to give a little bit of background as to who I am, because I know whenever I'm sitting somewhere and somebody starts talking to me, I want to know who they are and why I should listen to them. What Mr. Shepley's pointed out is part of my discussion here today is starting to talk to you all about serving as a trustee. What does that mean in terms of your roles and your responsibilities and how best you can perform those roles and responsibilities? And that's a two-part question, because it really is sort of knowing what it is that you're charged with doing, and then how is the best way for you to go about actually accomplishing what you've been appointed to do. And so this morning you're going to be hearing a bunch of stuff, and as the old saying goes, at times it'll feel like you're trying to drink from a fire hose. I've given you a packet of information. I do not expect that any of you will have gone through it and read it. There's a cover memo that I hope will be helpful, not just for today, but for going forward. And so some of these are really resource materials for you to have if a question comes up. Like, oh, I remember I have something on that. You may be able to get an answer to your question rather than wait a few weeks till the next library board meeting or till you have a chance to talk to Tom or to reach out to me in order to get an answer to that question. So as being trustees, as being members of the library board, there sort of are those two components, your individual membership as well as your collective identity as the library board. And the powers of the library board aren't ones that you came up with, either you or folks who were sitting in these chairs earlier. Those powers come from the Code of Virginia. There are some sections there that sort of outline how libraries can happen throughout Virginia. There are some, as we know, some of our neighboring jurisdictions, it's just run on the county level. The county has it, and it's one of their departments within the county. Cities also usually have their own library. But then there's the opportunity that we have taken advantage of to have regional libraries where multiple jurisdictions get together and they pool resources, whether those just be financial, but they also pool together buildings and spaces and payroll and all of those things to help make it more efficient, and especially for those localities that really can't afford to support their own library, we can sort of make the sum greater than the total of the parts. And so, as you all know, we are part of a regional library system, and so we have some of our rules are given by the state code, some of them are given by the library agreement itself, and I'll get to the library agreement in a little while. Now, some of your roles and responsibilities are purely administrative. You make sure that the bills get paid, so that the lights are on when they're supposed to be on. You make sure that there's enough employees. You've got the buildings, you want to make sure that there's enough employees on as part of your budget to ensure that the services are being provided. Some are really policy-based. You hear from the folks that you represent, or you hear from the community, what kind of programs are good? What kind of programs aren't so good? And those are ones that you have discussions and you work with staff to sort of develop those, but every library system has its own sort of I'm gonna say its mission statement in terms of the things that it wants to focus on. And those are really policy decisions. And then there are the hybrid ones, some that are partially administrative but partially policy as well. Some of that includes, as happens for me when every year with the Board of Supervisors, I have a performance evaluation. Part of that performance evaluation is how have you been doing on the nuts and bolts of things, but also are you doing what we think you should be doing, and what should you be doing more of in the next year? And so when you all have your performance review of the director, that's partially administrative, partially it's policy. And so, but that's a responsibility that you all have. Things like hours of operation, which may seem to be administrative, but they're also policy based as well. Do you want to make sure that that you're open late at night or early in the morning? Those, depending upon the community that's involved, that's a policy as well as an administrative type of decision. So those are the kinds of roles and responsibilities that you have, and you've got a whole list on your agenda of the other things that you'll be talking about. But how do you go about doing that? So now you know what it is that you're supposed to be doing. How do you go about doing that? And that's sort of, there's two components, as I mentioned, one of which is you don't lose your individuality when you become a member of a public body. That's part of the beauty of public bodies, is that they're made up of different individuals who have different experience, education, different sometimes ideological views, sometimes different, just sort of views of the world that differ. And we use those together. You bring your individualness together to try to make sure that items that you think are important are brought up, and that decisions that are made take into consideration various factors. So there's that individual aspect. There's also the matter of when you leave this room, you still are a member of this library board. So if you go to another library at another system and you happen to be visiting, you can see those things, and you can talk to somebody in the staff and say, hey, I'm on the library board for the Pamunkey Regional Library. I just noticed you guys have this. How does that work? How did you decide to do that? You can then bring that back to the full library board. The second part is, so that's your individuality, you bring that together. The second part is, how do you do your jobs as a library board? And the first and fundamental reason for all, that I want to make sure that you all understand is that any public body can only do its work at a meeting, which is what we have here. Now, those meetings can they can be monumental decisions, or they can just be paying the bills kind of decisions. But you all can only do your work in a meeting. And there are some rules that I'll go over in just a minute about how we make sure that those meetings are open, that the public is aware that they're going on, and that people understand, if they're present, what's going on, or if they aren't present, either beforehand they know what's going to be discussed, or afterwards they know what was discussed. So there's processes and procedures in doing that. So some of those questions that come up with how you do your work is, some of that is the legal stuff, but it's also the parliamentarian type of stuff, which is, as you saw just at the beginning of our meeting, sometimes can be a little thorny, but at the end of the day, the purpose is to try to make sure that everybody understands what's going on. It may not always be pretty, as they sometimes say. Sometimes it's sausage making, where at the end you wind up with a product that you're fine with. Sometimes you don't like to see it always be made, but at the end, everybody can get from point A to point B and realize how they got to where they were going to go. So just a little bit, the packet of information that I provided to you covers some of those things that are there. I'm going to highlight a couple of them. If you find me boring, you can go ahead and read it. I'm fine. I won't take offense. But so we talk a little bit about the Freedom of Information Act, and there's a couple-page summary that's on there that is probably easier to, I hope it's easier to digest that couple pages, but I have the entire Freedom of Information Act there. You should have it, if nothing else. If a question ever comes up, you know where to look. You can always contact me and say, I saw this in here, does that apply to us? But the Freedom of Information Act is something that certainly all public bodies need to be aware of. As I mentioned, there's also some sections in there from the Code of Virginia about library boards. I tried to include just the sections that deal with regional library boards, because you can have more advisory types of boards and situations where it's kind of a county department. That isn't what we have here. You all do you are more of an administrative than an advisory board. And then there's a memo which should be on the top, which covers some parliamentary type issues. And that's, I will get to that as well, because that is one of those things, especially for folks who are new to public bodies. For as long as I've been working with it, 20 plus years, both here and with the General Assembly, folks who are new to public bodies, it can seem overwhelming and it can seem confusing. That is not the purpose at all. And so I'm going to try to go through some common things that hopefully will make things more efficient and effective, because that's the goal. Everybody wants you to do the work that you do in a way that you're able to make the decisions that you feel are most appropriate in a timely manner, and in a way that people know what your decision is, so people don't leave the meeting saying, what the heck just happened here? I'm a big process person, so my thought is, I always want, as a lawyer, I don't weigh in on any of your policy decisions. My thought is, though, that a process that at the end people don't understand what happened, or they didn't feel like what they wanted to be heard was heard, that's a process that doesn't work. And that's a bad process, not because of what the decision was. It could be the best decision in the world, but if there was somebody who was sitting behind me here who at the end says, I don't know what they wanted to do, somebody tried to say what I wanted to be heard and got shouted down and didn't have an opportunity, nobody listened to them, that's not a good way to ensure that the public has confidence in the work that you do, so that when you make decisions, whether they agree with it 100% or 1%, they at least know the decision was made. You all get paid the big bucks, as they say, to make those decisions, and they may not be the big bucks, that should be air quotes, but that's what you're appointed to do. And sometimes those decisions are super easy to make, and sometimes they are not so easy to make, but that's what you've been appointed to do. And so the worst thing is for you to spend all that time and effort and for people to not know what it is that you did at the end of the day. So taking a half step back towards the Freedom of Information Act, everybody always talks about FOIA or VFOIA, depending upon where you read it. It's important to remember that there's two aspects to it, one of which is the public records side of FOIA, which is basically the understanding that records of public entities, public bodies, governmental agencies are not theirs. They are held in trust for the public. So the public has access to those. Now, there are some times where there's exceptions for good, legitimate reasons, privacy reasons, security reasons, why those may not be disclosed, but the concept is those records are the public. So that means one of two things. One of which is, the good news for you is probably 90+% of the records, Mr. Shepley and his folks, they control all of that. So if it's a matter of the budget, if it's a matter of these agendas and minutes, he'll keep them. But there are public records that may not seem to be public records, but they are. So if your neighbor knows that you're on the library board and says, hey, can you bring this up at the next library board meeting? That is a public record, because it is sent to you in essence, in your official capacity about a matter of public business. Doesn't matter what that form is. It could be an email, it could be a text, it just needs to be something tangible. So if they just ask you, that's not a public record. But if somebody sends you an email and says, the rest of your colleagues are nitwits, I think this is what you should do, yeah, it may not be something that you want everybody to see, but in essence, that's a public record. And members of the public who send emails, especially to elected officials, may not realize that when they do that, those records are public. So if I say I want, I live in the Ashland Magisterial District here in Hanover, if I were to say, I want to see every constituent email that was sent to Faye Pritchard on whatever topic that is, she'd have to go through, and if she received 40 emails, and it could have been the most complimentary of me as county attorney, or it could have been the nastiest, but she'd have to turn that over. That's a public record. And so as you do your work, in the back of your mind, if there's just remember that the work that you do as part of your job is for the public. So if you do get an email, I always suggest print it out, give it to Mr. Shapley and say, I received this, just want to make sure that you have it. He'll make sure, he may have been copied on it. If he's copied on it, then we have that. But what we don't want is for somebody to say, I sent emails to all the library board members and I didn't hear anything. And I want to know, and everybody says, well, there's no record of that. It's like, well, yeah, there may be a record of that. And it may be relevant whether or not you all received an email or not, but that's why we keep those records, because they're not ours individually, personally. They're held for the public trust. The second part of the Freedom of Information Act is open meetings, which is what we're doing here today. And those basically are a requirement that, one, as it says, they need to be open. We can't decide to just have a meeting, lock the doors, and not allow any of the public in. It also means that in order for it to truly be open, folks need to know that there is a meeting, where it is, usually what time it starts. Sometimes we'll talk about something, and when that goes out, usually there's a requirement that the agenda be posted, so folks know when, where, and what a meeting is going to be about. And so that's why you have agendas, and that's why Mr. Shepley and every public body that has a clerk, so to speak, make sure that those notices get posted. Depending upon what the meeting is, depending upon what the body is, that may just be put it on the bulletin board outside the administrative offices. There are times that you'll see it's in the newspaper. There are times that it needs to be on a website. There are times that we need to mail letters to individuals if they are particularly affected. FOIA is a general concept, but there may be individual additional requirements. Almost 100% of the work that you do, it's just going to be, you should set a schedule at the beginning of a year, or at least talk about that, and make sure that at the appropriate places for library administration that those notices are posted, so that folks say, hey, if I want to know when the library board is meeting, this is where I go. If I see something on the bulletin board, I know there's a meeting coming up. If there's nothing on the bulletin board, I know there isn't a meeting within the next 3 days, because FOIA requires at least a minimum of 3 days. So, as I mentioned, there are times that you will go into closed session. They're not very often. The most primary one that should come up on a regular basis is to talk about performance reviews, because that's a personnel matter. And certainly, and I'll use myself as the example, the public has a right to know that I'm the county attorney, and generally what my terms of condition, my terms of employment are, my salary, which I know you could ask for if you really wanted to know. The Times-Dispatch used to put it on the front page of the paper all the time.
Yep.
But if you wanted to know how the Board of Supervisors thought I was doing my job, that's in some ways kind of, if they thought I was speaking too fast, if I was speaking too slow, if I, just sort of the things that are like, oh, this is the normal kind of performance review things, the public does not have a right to know that aspect of my employment. And so the Board of Supervisors every year goes into closed session. I would assume the library board makes sure that every year you have a time that you set aside to discuss performance issues with the director. And that's a conversation. It's a two-way conversation, and so you want to have that in a setting that allows for that type of situation. There's also the only sort of limited type of issue that I could find that's sort of library specific is, I talked about public records before, and it also talks about discussions, is you can't have in records that sort of, and allow the public to sort of hear about that, talks about people and what they take out, for lack of a better term. You can sort of say we can have, we had 45,000 people who came up, but you can't discuss or release anything that sort of says that, I'll use myself, that Dennis Walter last year took out 10 books on the history of the United States. Now you can say we had 25 books on the history of the United States taken out, and we can say Dennis Walter is a library patron, but we can't connect those dots for good and obvious reasons. Additionally, you can't have anything that sort of identifies anybody under the age of 18. So you can't sort of say, oh yeah, these are the people, here are all the kids who come to the library. It's like, no, we don't disclose that information. Again, for good common sense reasons. So the Freedom of Information Act is that overarching thing that we remember, that generally the public has access to all the work that we do, can see all that we do, subject to some sort of very limited type of exceptions. So now that we know that we are going to have a meeting, we all get together, we gather at the appointed time and place, doors are open, folks come in. The next part is how you do your work. And that's where the rules of parliamentary procedure kind of come in. And hopefully my memo, I'm not going to go through it line by line, but I'm going to try to give sort of an overarching view of my view of what the rules of procedure are and how I think they can help you do your work well, and how if it gets confusing, even if you have the best intentions, it can make a good process not seem as good as it could be. So as an overarching principle, I say this all the time, rules of procedure are not intended to stifle discussion or debate. They are intended to sort of allow for the orderly discussion of items so that folks can understand what is going on, both you all who are actually doing the work, as well as everybody out here who is watching you do your work. It is not at all intended as a way as a tool, as a sword, to prevent people from being heard on an item. And so there's a perception that sometimes happens. But I will use an example, and it's not a great example, but it's the best example that I could think of. And that is sort of a recipe. We follow a recipe. And there's a reason why we follow a recipe. Because I say, if I wanted to make an omelet, I could take everything out of the fridge that I wanted, crack the eggs, throw in all the ingredients, pour it in the frying pan, cook it up, and it probably would be pretty close to an omelet, no matter what order I did all that stuff in. Now, if I wanted to make a cheesecake, and I took everything out of the fridge, mixed it all together, threw it in something and cooked it, I would be really lucky if it came out anywhere close to what a cheesecake is supposed to do. So you have rules. Some things have to happen before other things sometimes in order for you to go forward. You have to make the crust of the cheesecake before you can put the really good yummy stuff on top of it. But it's also a matter of a rules of procedure that the more you get used to it, it isn't a hard and fast. I always, when I cook at home, I have general rules. My wife will ask me, well, what's the recipe for that? I say, I don't have a recipe for that. I've been making something so long that I know this is the process that you do. If one time I want to add a little bit more of this, I'll do it. But at the end of the day, everybody knows what it is that I got done, even though I didn't follow the exact same steps. But sometimes at the end, you realize this is a mess. And you need to okay, we need to go back and figure out how we got here and do that. But that's kind of the concept, that we want to make sure that we have an understood way of going forward, realizing that there may be some minor modifications to that, so that we know that when we go from the beginning of the process to the end of the process, we have followed the general guidelines, so we wind up with cheesecake and not an omelet disguised that has cheesecake stuff as part of that. So the general way, and I think most of you know this because it's happened here already, is you operate by motion. It's sort of the concept of, hey, I think we should consider this, for lack of a better term. And the easiest way to do it is say, I move that, and whatever it is that you want to do. So I move that we amend the agenda. I move that we add this item. I move that we, if it's something that's more substantive, I move that we approve this item that we've been talking about, or I move that we deny this item. It's really a matter of getting that concept, that proposal to be discussed. Because you are a public body made up of multiple members, not every idea is something that you all should discuss, which is why we require a second, which is sort of a, hey, what about, followed by a, yeah, we should talk about that. Person who makes a second is just basically saying, I agree that that's something that we should talk about. There's no requirement that if you make the motion or if you second the motion, that at the end of the day, you vote in favor of that. Sometimes you're like, we need to talk about this. So I move that we adopt this policy, but I think it's a terrible policy, and I think we need to do more work before we go ahead and do that. You can certainly do that as part of the process, but until somebody actually makes that motion, there really isn't something to discuss. You can have a presentation and ask questions, but if you're actually going to be making a decision, you kind of want to have something out there so folks can have that, for lack of a better term, you have an anchor that you can say, I agree with this, and here's why I agree with it, or I don't agree with it, and here's why I don't agree with it, so that you get to the end of the day where the question is thumbs up or thumbs down. and you all have had the opportunity to know what it is you're talking about. You can ask questions. You can make sure that you are comfortable with what's being discussed. So you have the motion, you have the second, and then the concept then, as I said, is that you can then talk about it. You can have discussion. You can have debate. You may want to find that you all are of one mind, which I realize is probably, you know, those instances are few and far between, but sometimes you're like, does anybody have any questions? And nobody may have any questions. Or you may say, does anybody have any questions? And everybody's hand goes up, and you realize it's going to be a lengthy discussion. And sometimes you need to have those lengthy discussions. The one thing that I would say is it's kind of like at the dinner table at home. There are times where you need to have somebody who just sort of says, look, we have lots of people with lots of ideas. We're going to do this one at a time. And I'm going to be the one who's just going to make sure that everybody has a chance to speak. Nobody speaks over other people. Nobody interrupts anybody. So the more formal way, the way that I was sort of trained down at the General Assembly, is things should go through the chair.
Right.
They don't always have to, but you should not have questions that go from one library board member to another. If somebody's in the middle of speaking, you should wait till they're finished. Everybody has an opportunity to be heard. But if there is something, and it's come up, where you say, Madam Chair, I have a question. The chair can then say, okay, can you wait a second, till we finish this? I'll make a note, I'll get back to you, or it could be, go ahead, state your question, because it may be appropriate. So the chair kind of serves as a gatekeeper, not in the sense of deciding, I don't want to hear this. It's more a matter to make sure that it happens in an orderly manner, because if, for instance, one of you had a question right now about something later on the agenda, it might not be appropriate to interrupt my presentation to consider that, but it may be a matter of, okay, well, we'll make a note of that and we'll get back to it at an appropriate time. So it may seem a little formal, but I always think that if you say, Madam Chair, and wait for a response, you're going to have a much better discussion than if people just sort of start saying something. I know for new folks, that takes a little while to get used to. And it may seem overly formal, but once everybody's sort of gets that flow, it actually works really well. I probably have been at 300 or 400 public meetings where I've served as counsel, and when that happens, I find the discussion is better because people listen to other folks because they realize I have something that I want to say. I need to wait till they're finished before I say it. So you have to kind of listen to what they're saying to make sure that they're finished with it. And sometimes they may, in their talking about it, they may have answered the question that you had. And you say, oh, okay, I had a question, but I don't need to ask that anymore. Or your question may be even more so. You're like, oh, well, I started off when we started talking about this, having these questions. I'm even more confused now. Those are all things that sort of listening and weighing in at the appropriate times, I think are really helpful. So on the memo that you have are some of the different processes and procedures in terms of making the motion in a second, and then if somebody wants to amend a motion or they want to withdraw a motion, some of the nuts and bolts of that, and there's actually little boxes that have suggested language to help that out. Just take a look at it. See, so the next time you think about it, you're like, okay, somebody's made a motion, it's been seconded, I want to add something, here is how I should phrase how I want to add something. Are you willing to amend that motion? If I made the motion and I realized, oh, I should have included something else, I want to modify my motion. I originally had said I want these 3 things, I realized I wanted a 4th thing as well, so I'd like to modify it to add that 4th thing. Well, you can do that. And then the person who made the second, if they're okay with that modification, it's kind of an informal way to do it rather than the more formal amendment process. So,
Ms. Walters, what you just described, of course, I was trained under Robert rules by Mr. Hobbs and Ms. Barker. So that's the way everything was run, that the chairman would recognize the speaker and then recognize the next speaker. Don't you think it really is the better way to run a meeting, that whoever is speaking has the floor, and then whoever wishes to speak asks for the chair to recognize them next, because and I'm guilty of doing it too. I'm guilty of starting to speak where the other person is speaking.
I think it certainly is helpful.
It leads to, as you say, it leads to a better discussion.
And I will just say this, and for folks who take notes, or you go back and listen to a recording, or you're trying to figure out what's going on, having those folks cross-talking makes it where you don't hear anything. And it may make sense when you're sitting here watching, or like live in person.
Yeah.
I will use a good example. When I first started being a lawyer, and I've read my first transcript of my speaking, I'm like, I can't believe I speak that way, because if you just talk with somebody, you will realize, if you read it, that most people do not speak in complete sentences. We sort of understand, we speak in phrases because we, in context, can fill that in. When you go back and you read it, it's very different. And so if you're taking minutes and you're going back and you have two people talking and people saying yes, you don't know who they're saying yes to, yet you don't see nodding of heads in the same way. So so when you take a vote, it isn't all in favor, nod your head. We say all in favor, say aye, so that way if somebody is listening, they can actually see, and they can actually hear who voted the way that they did.
And to my colleagues, particularly my new colleagues, I'm saying that to myself as much as I'm saying it to the table. I think that's been one of the mistakes that we've made as our meetings just became more and more casual when no one was here and we were sitting around a table.
And there are times when that sort of informal type works fine. And the more formal things actually make it more of a stilted conversation. But it's easier to go from the rules to softening the rules than to go the other way around, at least in my experience. So in a nutshell, that's sort of my views on parliamentary procedure. The important goal always is to ensure that you all know what you're doing and folks who are watching, you know what you're doing. So there's no magic words that must be said, but so long as everybody understands what's going on, that is the purpose of rules of order. As I said, I'm always happy to answer. I've received a few phone calls from some of you over time with questions. I know there's been some discussion about whether in the future either I or somebody else from my office should be here on a more regular basis just to be available for questions, and I'm certainly open to that. I realize I have some time constraints because you all meet usually on the fourth Wednesday of the month, which is the same time that the Board of Supervisors for Hanover meets, and so sometimes these meetings overlap, but certainly if I can provide some more support individually, either in this formal setting or an informal setting, please reach out to me. I have cards, I'll make sure you have them all towards the end. So before I go to the next part, which I'm just going to try to do real quick on the, unless Tom doesn't want me to, on the regional agreement and bylaws and just, that's going to be a 20,000-foot view, just so you know. I'm not here to, but does anybody have any questions on motions and meetings and those sorts of things?
I don't have a question, but I have I was working on something for church with Presbytery, and they had a guide and a reference sheet to Robert's Rules of Order for motions. And
Okay.
it's just one that I was just gonna pass out. You know, you're welcome to look at it. But it just kind of gives an explanation of, which motions need a second, which ones don't need a second, which can have discussion, that
Yes.
kind of thing.
One thing that I would point out, and everybody always views Robert's Rules of Order as this great, all-knowing, actually, Robert's Rules of Order, in its most formal setting, is awful for public bodies. Because, well, I will say, because first and foremost, most Robert's Rules of Orders are for very large assemblies. And almost in all of them, the chair cannot vote, cannot make a motion, cannot talk substantively on any of this stuff. They really are just an officer. for public bodies where you are appointed to represent a constituency, whether you're elected or appointed, you can't lose that by being the chair. I mean, that would make no sense whatsoever. So a pure Roberts doesn't work anywhere, but the framework of Robert's Rules of Order does, and that is to ensure that everybody knows what the rules are. I mean, when you're growing up as a kid, you knew you played certain games, you had the rules that you did, and they were different than if you went over to, you got together with a friend after school and you went over and you're like, wow, when we play basketball, this is a foul, and it's not here, or, it was the old Calvin and Hobbes, it was Calvin ball, the way the rules were constantly changing. That doesn't work. So the goal is to agree on a set of rules so that everybody knows how to go forward.
Madam Chair, can I ask a question? One question. You talked about closed meetings, and we certainly had one briefly to talk about Mr. Shepley. So I know that's a personnel matter. What other matters could we potentially go into closed session for?
For the most part, they tend to be legal matters. So there are some if the library board was sued and you wanted to have a discussion with me as to what it meant and how are we going to respond and things like that, that's appropriate for a closed session. Now, I could have those conversations individually, but if at the end of that, the library board were to say, you know what, we want you to do X, I kind of need to know that from all of you, not just from one, because no one individual member can sort of speak on behalf of the library board. So there's the legal stuff. There are the personnel matters. Occasionally, it's what is within your roles and responsibilities. Sometimes it's a matter of like property acquisition. Should we buy X versus Y? And there are negotiations as to prices. Most of those are not handled by you all.
Right.
For instance, the dirt that we're sitting on right now was part of a rezoning case for the Rutland area, and part of that was that the owner was going to donate that land to the county. The county oversaw the construction, and the library uses that, but as far as I know, the county owns the dirt underneath us. But if the library board had been the owner of the dirt and built, there would have been discussions about, hey, how much are we going to pay for this? And they came in with $750,000 for the property, and we only want to pay $650,000. So you have those negotiations that go back and forth. Those are the types of things, but largely yours will be the personnel type of things, as well as litigation, pure legal matters that an attorney-client discussion in open session would not be appropriate.
Very good. Thank you.
I think she's got a question. I don't know.
Madam Chair, can I ask a question? Sure. Sorry, I'm like raising my hand like I'm in school. So I know in the June meeting that this library board passed a FOIA policy for Pamunkey Regional Library. I'm assuming that's in line with the policies as laid out in the Virginia Code. Was that something you were involved in, or?
I was indirectly involved with it. This past year, the General Assembly passed a requirement that I think it was this year they passed it, but by July 1, all public bodies needed to have their FOIA policy put on the website. Hanover County has one, and my office worked on that, and I know I discussed with Mr. Shepley over the course of time, it's largely modeled on other public bodies, so the policy itself is a generally accepted one, and I've looked at it, and it appears to completely comply, not only with FOIA in general, but with the requirement that it be posted.
Okay, so that is posted on our website, Mr. Shepley, the FOIA?
I think it needs to be added, to be honest.
Okay.
I thought I saw it someplace now how easy it is to find, and that's one of the things that if you all find that the website could be improved because you can't find anything on it, that's the type of thing to have a discussion as some of your policy types of things, because that is certainly one of those items that those who are not technologically advanced sometimes have challenges with.
Madam Chair? To clarify, actually, it is on the website because it was posted as a policy. we would like to do some work and update the policies longer term as a project. And that's kind of what I was thinking of. I mean, technically it is. I would suggest that organizationally, we might want to have a better approach.
So it's under the policy section?
It is not there yet.
It's
It
not
is
there
still with the June meeting documents.
Okay. Is that something that could be sent out to those of us who are new, just so we have a copy of that?
I have a copy for you today.
Okay, awesome. Can I ask one additional question, Madam Chair?
Sure.
I know there has to be an officer, a FOIA officer identified within Pamunkey Regional Library. Who is that officer?
The library director.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Shepley, I appreciate that.
So the next part that I wanted to just touch on briefly is the library agreement. To be honest, I'm not sure when the very first library agreement went in, but looking at the bylaws, the fact that there was originally in 1977, I suspect that there has been a regional agreement for the library for 50-ish years or so.
1940?
1940. So this is not something brand new, but the agreement that we are currently operating on has been in place since 1996. That is between Hanover, Goochland, King William, and King and Queen counties. And it's, the agreement itself is towards maybe the very last document in the packet. It actually contains two parts, one of which is the revised agreement, so it revised the 1993 agreement between the counties, and then there's a supplemental agreement, which I'll get to in a minute. And it highlights some of, I'm going to call it the big picture things. The last agreement before that looked like, so the code provides that you can have these regional agreements, and says that in the past, where it was not in the Code of Virginia exactly how you do it, they had added it to the code. The boards of all the different counties got together and decided to formalize that, and so it basically says we're going to have a regional library system as set forth in the Code of Virginia and how many members there are. So the library board has 10 members, and that division is set out there. So Hanover has 4, and then there are 2 from each of the other jurisdictions. And then it talks about terms of office. So that sort of is your guiding document in terms of how many people serve, where they're from, who appoints them, and for how long that they serve. There's not a whole lot more to the agreement, since a lot of it is covered in state code, but it basically says you all have all the powers that the Code of Virginia provides for you, and there's always that provision, because under the Constitution of Virginia, you cannot bind future governing bodies to pay money. There's always the subject to lawful appropriations, which to date has not been an issue. I know there is some discussion about one of the jurisdictions going forward, but as of now, everybody has contributed in accordance with this agreement. So that is the overarching, the jurisdictions get together. The supplemental agreement, which is the next couple of pages, is one that was entered into between the library board and Hanover County itself. Hanover, as you all know, is the largest of the jurisdictions in terms of population and in terms of the financial contribution, but there's also, as you can see in the supplemental agreement, there's a lot of non-financial support that Hanover does, and we're happy to do that. But as you can see, and partly why, as we're reviewing these agreements, and may need to be updated because it talks about the use of 4 county-owned buildings, and it's Ashland, Hanover Courthouse, Mechanicsville, and Rockville. Those facilities, thankfully, some of them have been updated. This building that we're in right now is an owned building. It used to be, the library for Atlee used to be a leased building across the road in the shopping center. And so there's talk about how the county will provide those buildings, how the county will provide for maintenance, including property insurance for the building, so that the library board doesn't have to do that. Library staff are able to benefit from a lot of the Hanover County operations in terms of payroll, in terms of health insurance. The finance department, as far as I know, organizes all the VRS payments to make sure all of that happens. So a lot of the support systems that are in place are because of this agreement, and including, as to show how dated it is, the option of participation in the county, quote, local area network, to show how long ago this was put in there. And I should know the number for this. I was hoping to, yes, so the option of assistance from the county attorney, to the extent that that my office is able to do so. And so those are the two agreements that are in place. So we have the generalized rules and powers and duties that are set out in the Code of Virginia, and we know that these are the folks who have joined together to form this regional library. As I mentioned, there is some discussion about reviewing this, whether any of the terms need to be changed, or whether we just need to have something updated, because as you can see, it was 1996, it looked like the last agreement before that was probably 20 years or so earlier. It's every generation, we should update it to, just, if nothing else, to reflect the current positions. We should have, for instance, I think, if we're going to do another one of these, to have an exhibit that lists the library locations, and then if we want to modify those as time goes on, we can just modify the list rather than modifying the underlying agreement, because there isn't a list of the various library facilities. In addition to the library, what most people know is the traditional library facilities, we also have administrative offices that are part of the system, even though the public doesn't usually go there to try to take out materials. This is the governing body by which you all operate, and through that, we then go to the next item, which is, now that you know what that is, you then have your bylaws. So does anybody have any questions before I go on? I don't want to move on to the bylaws, which again, I'm going to go through pretty quickly. But
Madam Chair, I have a question. Yes. And obviously, I am a new member, and I have had no prior orientation to this, so I have some questions about things that I see come up in this.
Okay.
For example, in the actual initial agreement, I'd be curious to know what are the minimum annual requirements for state aid, as that's specifically listed in the agreement. And I would also like to understand the population for each county and the formula used for the appropriation request to the county, since those are things mentioned here. Obviously, I'm not expecting that you know the answers to those questions, but as a new member, what's my recourse for getting answers? And not just for me, but for others who are new on the board and are also curious about these things.
my suggestion on that is if you have some specific questions, Madam Chair, is you can state them, and Mr. Shepley and I will work to the best that we can. I will say the population in 2000, the proportions are different than they are after 2020.
Sure.
I know Hanover County in the past 20 years has gone from right around, I think it was right around 90,000 in 2000. We're now just about 110,000. I think the percentage increases for the different counties is not identical. I think King William and I'm not sure about King William. I think they've actually had a higher percentage of increase, but that's one of the things in terms of apportioning how it is. It needs to be rough. We're not going to do a percentage, but I think at the time it was intended to somewhat be proportional. Whether that still is probably something that we can look into. I know that the county administrators are having discussions about that, but certainly I would think if you all should have that information, and if you want anything to be considered, either working through staff or adopting a resolution or making a motion that your concerns be transmitted to the governing bodies of the jurisdictions, is certainly something that could be done.
So those two questions that I stated, can those be noted and we come back to those at some point, or do you need me to repeat them, or?
I think by next meeting probably, and it doesn't have to wait till next meeting. We may be able to distribute that information to all the library board members, but my understanding was the population and
The minimum requirements for state aid is also listed in that original document.
I think we can do that.
Talk about both of those.
I have an additional question about the supplement, if I'm allowed to ask another question. Is Hanover the only one with a supplemental agreement?
As far as I know, we are. Mr. Shepley, do you know of any other supplemental agreements?
I know of no others.
Okay, that's definitive answer. And are all of these services still used by PRL that are listed here?
Madam Chair, so the agreement states that we may use them, not that we have to or will. We do use many of them. I would really need to look at the list again. We are tied to the county. We use their fleet services for maintenance, the financial systems for our finances, the county attorney, trying to think who else are the common ones, the HR and the payroll system, which is Kronos. We use theirs for that as well, so it's very helpful.
Madam Chair, could I ask another question?
Yes, ma'am?
Does any money flow between Hanover and PRL for these services that are provided, or is that out of Hanover's good heart or whatever?
A little of both. When we review the audit, probably at the next meeting, we'll go over that. The counties that provide additional assistance, or in the case of West Point, the town, that is part of our audit. We demonstrate what those contributions have been as in-kind contributions. So there's credit to them for that. But no, there's no payment, if you will, for the use of those systems.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the last thing that I have, and I'm trying to be mindful of everyone's time, is I'm just going to go briefly over bylaws. The concept of bylaws is pretty universal among public bodies in the sense that they provide sort of the framework by which you understand how you're going to do the work that you're supposed to be doing in a way that makes it somewhat regular, so everybody understands the general rules, understanding that almost every bylaw has a provision that things can be modified based upon the circumstances. So as you can see in the library board's bylaws, starts talking about membership, and then meetings in terms of the minimum number of meetings that you have, if you need to have a special meeting, how those are called, the concept of quorum, which is a requirement that in order for the board to act, you need to have a majority of the members. Lawyers and parliamentarians don't like even numbers when it comes to boards, but you all have 10. So because the reason why is because 5 is not a majority. 5 is the halfway point, so you need to have 6 members. So you would, if you have 11 members, you need to have 6. If you have 10 members, you still need to have 6. So from a math perspective only, that becomes problematic. So you need to have a quorum in order to act. There's a general guideline for your order of business. Doesn't have to be followed all the time. There are instances like today where it's more of a presentations than substantive matters, but you sort of have the old business and new business types of things. You get reports. There's a provision that Roberts generally governs these rules. There's talk about the officers, how you choose them, what their authority is, and who acts if they can't be there. So if the chair can't be there, the vice chair will serve in the chair's absence. There are issues about standing committees and how you appoint, if you want to have a special committee to study a particular issue, how that is done, and then how you amend these bylaws. And then there's concepts for, an outline of the general duties, both of the library board as well as the director, because as you probably have seen multiple times, there's a distinction between the chief administrative officer and the board overseeing that. Sometimes those lines get a little blurry. Sometimes people want to do the job that the other one is doing for a variety of reasons, but there are distinct lines between those two. And some of those lines are for good reasons to ensure that, not so much that people stay in their lane in the negative way, but that you do the work that you're supposed to do, and staff does the work that they're supposed to do, and you don't have the confusion of, well, if you start picking who works behind the desk at particular times, well, what if that person can't show up that day? You can't meet and schedule who's gonna be the replacement. So clearly that's an administrative type of situation. But you also don't want the director to be going out there without any guidance on making issues that are policy type ones. So you wanna make sure that you have both of those functions. And then there's a provision for citizens' time. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's no requirement for citizens' time at library board meetings, but most public bodies provide for some amount of time. There's even a provision in your rules that if you're discussing a substantive issue, you have citizens' time at the beginning, people get up here and then they hear you start talking about something and say, I want to be heard on this because I didn't realize that this is what you're going to talk about. The concept is to allow for an orderly way for people to do it, so they don't just scream out from, and you don't start having conversations between one library board member and somebody in there. You sort of say, okay, if there's somebody who wants to speak, come on up, tell us your name, you will have, and you can make a determination, you'll have a minute, you'll have 2 minutes, well, that way everybody has the same amount of time. Address the library board as a whole, not individual members. And then when you're done, if folks have questions, there may be questions for that, but you do it in a way that, again, allows everybody the opportunity to come forward. People are not talking over each other. People are not talking, if I turn around, that's never a good thing, because it's always a matter of, you all are doing your work. If I'm a member of the public, I'm here to help you do your work. I can educate these folks outside. I can't educate you outside. And so I think that the bylaws that you have are a good framework. And certainly they were last amended just a few years ago. So unless there's a major need to change them, unless you find that they're not working, I think they're in good shape. So I think those are most of the legal type stuff. I think after that on the list, most of them go into organizational stuff. I do have on my note, this was sort of the time that was added for the legal Q&A, to the extent that exists. I'm happy to answer any questions, realizing up front that I may say that that's something I will either need to follow up offline, or we'll need to find a good way to do that. But if anybody has any questions before we move on to that, I'm happy to answer.
Just,
Sorry,
No,
Madam
go
Chair, I
ahead.
had a question. What is the legal responsibility for the audit, the financial audit? Is there a determination as to how often that is to occur?
I believe the audit happens every year.
Annual.
Yeah.
Yes.
Annually, okay.
Yes.
And
Part
who
of
performs-
my role in that, so an audit is an overall type of thing, and I'm only going to be able to speak to my role in that audit, and Mr. Shepley will certainly be able to fill in the blanks. I'm asked every year by the auditor if there are any lawsuits against the library board that they should be aware of, because those are potential liabilities for the library system. And it's usually a set amount, I think it's $35,000. So if I'm aware of any of those, since I am I would be the one who would know that information, I have to certify that here's a lawsuit that's going on. So when I get a similar letter for the county has like multiple pages of possible lawsuits and claims that have been filed. In the time that I've been working with the library, it's always been, to my knowledge, there are no lawsuits, there are no outstanding claims against the library that need to be reported. There's a whole financial side of that audit as well, which I am not a part of the process, but that the auditors look at all of that together.
Okay.
I don't know if, is that at least a thumbnail sketch that I didn't goof up too much on?
You're correct.
Okay.
I just wondered if there is any penalty for late audit. Is there, if you're supposed to have it once a year and it continues to get delayed, is there legally any recourse or any penalty for that, financial?
So I think that was two different, because there's the
Financial.
legal side and there's the financial side. My understanding is if your audits aren't up to date, it can impact, for instance, your ability to borrow money and those kinds of financial impacts. I'm not aware of, if you don't have your audit filed by September 1, you're assessed a penalty of this
Okay,
amount or something
thank
like
you,
that.
yeah.
But there are consequences if you do not have the audits done appropriately, but my understanding is that there's no legal, criminal penalty or civil penalty associated with that.
Thank you.
Madam Chairman, could I ask a question, please?
Sure.
Okay, one of the things is that when you were talking about meetings, all right, special meetings or specific meetings for conducting a study or something on some aspect of the library system. I'm a new member. I'm still fairly ignorant about even listening to you. It's wonderful to hear the amount of information that you provided. But I still have lots of questions, and one of the board members asked some questions that I myself would like to have answers to those. If I requested a joint meeting with Mr. Shepley and others on the newer members or any member of the board to go through some specifics about items, again, that Ms. Schumacher was mentioning, is that a meeting of the board? Do you need special notice to the public that you're gonna
It depends.
visit with your?
It depends upon how many folks are involved. So if you wanted to just schedule some time with Mr. Shepley and me and wanted to come in, that is not a meeting of the entire library board.
Right.
And in fact, the Freedom of Information Act recognizes that that's a good thing. We don't want to discourage individual board members from going to staff and asking questions. The way that the Freedom of Information Act is set up is that you can have meetings of 2 board members, or members of a public body, but once you get to 3, then it becomes a public meeting. And they had to draw a line somewhere. And for the most part, that is because the smallest public bodies that are out there, for the most part, are usually about 5 members. And so once you get to 3, you kind of are you're at a quorum for a meeting. And so, in essence, the 3 of them getting together somewhere, even just listening to information, they could legally do something. They could say, we agree with this, we want you to change it. And so if you and Ms. Schumacher, I'll just use that as an example, wanted to set up some time to come in and say, you know what, we just want to go over the budget numbers. We just want to sit down and go over, and we don't want to waste up a whole bunch of time at a meeting, but we need to understand what's going on. That is the perfect opportunity to reach out to staff and say, we'd like to come in, when is a good time for us to come in? Now, the whole board can't go in there, and if there are 4 people who have the same question, but it's really just a matter of distributing information, sometimes you can send that out by an email. It's like, you don't have a conversation, but it's like, you asked for this information, here it is, or you can come in 1 at a time, or 2 by 2s.
I can't ask, formulate all the questions that I might have. I was in his position with a organization, nonprofit, fairly substantial nonprofit, and some of the questions I would have would maybe relate to the way I was involved in that, and how does that transfer to a public body, right? A nonprofit is governed by FOIA and things like that, but not in the same sense as this board is. And so I'd like to have some of those discussions, particularly with regard to budget, right? And how does that work? And I heard her say some things like that, and so I could go in and use some of his time, same question here, so how does that work? I'm just trying to give
I don't want to offer up his schedule or his time,
efficiency more than anything.
but certainly that is something that I would suggest, if you have questions about any of the work that you do. If it's legal in nature, you can shoot me an email, you can call me on the phone.
Strictly informational.
If it's strictly informational, I would suggest reaching out to Mr. Shepley and just say, I need a half hour of your time, I need an hour of your time. When is the best time for that to happen? It can be before a meeting, it can be after a meeting, it just, at a mutually convenient time. But that's certainly, if you have questions, we want to make sure you get that information.
Sure.
Madam
Quick
Chair,
one.
oh, sorry.
I just have a quick one. I wanted to clarify the quorum. The regional agreement says we're a body of 10, but we actually only have 9. So I'm trying to, is it 5 or is it 6 based on what's in the agreement or what we actually have?
So,
Madam Chair,
Yes.
so there are 10 members, it's a 10-member board. Because you have a vacancy, that does not
Okay,
change
so it's-
the quorum,
it's
because
six.
the quorum is
Yes.
specified as
Thank you.
6 in your bylaws. Yes, sir.
Perfect. Thank you.
which is why whenever we have vacancies, we always suggest the appointing authority make those,
Got it.
because, as Mr. Shelley, if you start getting down 2 or 3, which sometimes happens depending, you start running into issues of not even being able to have meetings.
Right. Got it. Thank you.
Kristen?
I'm wondering how the Hanover Board of Supervisors handles social events. And my question is more, there are quite a few of us who are new and don't necessarily know each other, and don't know staff. Is there an allowance for having some kind of welcome luncheon or something where business is not discussed, or is that discouraged because of being a public body?
So the Freedom of Information Act specifically excludes, I'm gonna call them social events, or really any events where more than 2 members get together, as long as they're not talking about public business. And I will use the sad but good example of somebody that you all might know passes away. So you all go to the funeral. Now, you're not there to discuss public business. There's no prohibition on doing that. And if there's a reception afterwards, you can go there and you can talk with each other. It isn't a matter of that when you're outside this room, you have to pretend that you don't know anybody else who's on here. You just can't talk about the public business when there's 3 of you or more gathered. So my advice always is on that is, when you see more than one of your colleagues, just be careful. Realize that if you're having a conversation, you meet at the grocery store, and you're saying, hey, don't talk about work. Or if you do, don't talk about anything other than, well, I'll see you at the next meeting, those types of things. Because if somebody's walking by and they happen to hear you talking about stuff, even if you are not officially talking about business, it puts into question whether or not you were. And again, it goes to the public confidence in this process. So, no, don't get together with that. Just be careful that you aren't talking about substantive matters. You can certainly get together and talk about your families and your backgrounds. That's all perfectly fine and is not discouraged in any way.
Any
Madam
other
Chair.
questions? Okay, John?
Mr. Walter, distribution of information via email and discussion of that information. So if Mr. Shepley sends us all something and we all start chiming in our opinion on that, that's a public meeting being handled out of the public.
It can become a public meeting depending upon how it's done. And the Supreme Court of Virginia has actually ruled on it, and it becomes really fact-specific. And so what they said in that particular case is it depends upon how soon all of that happens. So if an email goes out on Monday morning and each one of you responds once per day, so over the course of 10 days, even the vacant person weighs in, everybody has weighed in on it. That is probably not going to be perceived as a meeting, but if, and this happens in my family quite often, I send a text out to everybody in my family, and within 45 seconds, my number has gone from 0 to 18. Well, that's really simultaneous conversations. That is probably a public meeting, in the sense that if you all were on a text thread, please do not get all on a text thread together, but if you all were and somebody started doing something and then people are weighing in, that probably is. So my suggestion is whenever when that information comes out, if you have a question, reply all is a terrible thing when it comes to things like that. So if you have a question for one person on there, send it to that one person and say, oh, is this the issue you were talking about? Don't send that to the entire group. You can send it to another library board member. Or you could, if it's back to Mr. Shepley, if it's a follow-up question, you can certainly have that. And then he can decide if it's something like, oh, I wasn't clear in my first email because I've received 3 separate emails asking me what I meant by that. He can then distribute that information in a way that is much more one-directional than multi-directional.
Thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else?
I'm just looking at I probably will be able to be here for another 20 minutes or so, so as Mr. Shepley goes through his things, if there are any legal questions that are appropriate, I'm happy, ask me to come on up. But as I mentioned, and this is something that I do want you all to ponder, is whether or not you would like me or somebody from my office to be here on a more regular basis, because that's going to just be a discussion of how we make that work out. Happy to do it. I'm going to call it, it's an incremental cost to the work. It's not going to cost my office anymore, so I know there are concerns about that. So long as the schedule permits it, I'm happy to do it. And as you can tell, since I've been talking for an hour, I have no problems speaking on whatever I can do to help make you all do your work better. But I appreciate your time and I appreciate your questions. I have cards. I will make sure I get them all to you, so that way you can contact me directly if you do have any follow-up questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okey-doke. Mr. Shepley?
We're gonna take just a second and do a little reset. I've got some handouts for the board, and I'll be right back.
While they're handing this out, we'll take a little break.
Can we take a break, please?
Yeah, let's take a quick break.
Let's take a break.
Let's take a quick break. Yep.
Everybody else is going into that.
Good idea.
Nothing else, we let the blood circulate.
Can you get by?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. response to that?
She said she would talk to the board. I told her, I said, we really need somebody to fill that vacancy.
I'm the opposite.
Sweater.
I sweat in all social situations. I'm always hot.
So you're all under the vent?
If you'd like to come over.
It's a big bummer.
Thank you for that.
We're already way behind schedule.
Ask Mr. Shepard.
I would love to figure out how to keep our meetings to
You and me both.
even my town council meetings.
I'm just.
Deal with everything. System.
Just got well. Thank you. Would it make sense to delay that to our next meeting?
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. That was very helpful.
thank you.
Appreciate that.
I don't think so, because much of the questions that you're asking.
Thanks very much, appreciate it. It's very informative. Definitely.
So if you see an email
Every other month.
You know what I'm saying?
Come out from
Can't get out of doing two and four, especially.
I generally don't respond.
yeah, and you, I was gonna say, and you don't see that I respond, that's
Yeah. I agree.
it's not that I hadn't read it.
Yeah. Not being rude,
Yeah, I may say
being
something,
smart.
I may say something simple, you know.
Yeah, I don't know that we need necessarily.
Which is why
We need to set policies. We need to approve budget. And we need to have our library.
Have to do it in advance.
I already have a binder, I think it's this size.
Yeah.
So I'm like,
But we, and the
no
other
one.
thing,
That's why I didn't like the whole bag in, because it's,
this is what, my 12th year,
no, that can be cut off from last year.
Yeah,
This
I
will be
think
the
it's
beginning of this year.
approved meetings and everything.
That's in my office.
we have
Done,
to
so.
close sessions. It's been for the
Anytime, Tom?
Personnel.
you're calling us back to order?
Let's come back to order.
there could be occasions when
Proceed.
there were,
You say that into the microphone.
Patricia, you're too nice and soft-spoken.
we don't buy the property. You know, we're not in there.
Let's come back to order now. Mr. Shipley will
Thank you, ma'am.
proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am Tom Shepley. I'm the director of the library, and I'm going to try to cover these other items, which I think will answer a plethora of questions that have been asked. I've given everybody a notebook. Yours are white and in front of you. I am going to be going through the materials relatively quickly. Very little of it will you need to see on the screen, but I did that for folks in the audience. I don't have everything, but I have a lot of it. So the first document in the notebook is the bylaws themselves. And I appreciate Mr. Walter saying they seem to be, pretty solid. I would kind of suggest that over this past year, we've dealt with a lot of different situations that we've had some questions, and we have 3 new folks on the board now as well. I kind of think this is a good time to have the board review them and possibly update them, make some clarifications about things. We've done that on the fly with things like citizens' time this year. But it might be good that we go ahead and memorialize some of that, think ahead, to make everything work a little bit better that way. That's something, according to the bylaws, you have to have your discussion, presentation of your changes currently at one meeting, and then you vote on them at the next meeting. They're presented to you and to the public. But it seems to me this is a good opportunity with the current structure. 5 of you have been here less than a year. it's a fairly fresh board, so that would be my recommendation. Not gonna go into that a whole lot. I would suggest if we're gonna do that, we schedule that, so we have that as a priority through the year, and we'll talk about some of that in just a few minutes. Moving through the notebook, I wanted to provide the organizational chart for the library. And I'm going to try to move this so folks can see it. At the top, we have the 4 counties, citizens of Goochland, Hanover, King and Queen and King William counties. We have the Pamunkey Regional Library Board of Trustees, which currently has 9 people appointed, but there are 10 slots. We have a budget of about $5.8 million. We have around 67 FTE, and it floats right around 135 people.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
What is FTE?
Full-time equivalents.
Full-time equivalents.
The-
Thank you.
Of the 135 employees, about 30 of them are full-time. Everyone else is part-time. They range in hours from, I would say, from about 6 or 8 up to 18, 19 into part-time folks.
Thank you.
Thank you. The library board hires the library director. I was hired 14 years ago. Been plugging along since, trying to help him make the library a better place. And currently, folks reporting to me, we have 2 deputy directors. They share responsibility for the branches. Each one of the branches has a branch manager. There are associates, programmers, custodians, a few librarians at the branches as well. We have a collection strategy department, and we call it that because we are strategic with the materials that we are purchasing, acquiring, weeding from the collection when we do that. And I'm sorry, because I see that there is a mistake in my org chart. I've got a bad tab in there. Sorry. Underneath the collection strategy librarian, you can see IT supervisor and network engineer. The IT supervisor does not report to the collection strategy librarian. They report to the director. They should be in this line. Sorry about that, but we have 2 people for IT, 2 positions. And then in the office, we have a business operations manager and an administrative assistant. Of the full-time staff, many, not all of them, but many of them are librarians. When you think of a librarian is not everyone who works at the library, kind of like not everybody who works for the county is a county administrator, if you will. Librarians have specialized training, master's degrees. In the public library setting, they typically have a master's in library and information science from an American Library Association accredited program. And most of our librarians do work in administration. Both the deputy directors, the collection strategy librarian, and the 2 collection librarians are MLS librarians. We do have a few people, about 5, 6 people in the branches that are librarians. Not all of the branch managers are librarians. 2 of them currently are. And I say that because if you go to Henrico, for instance, they probably have almost as many librarians working at Libby Mill or Verina as we do system-wide. It's an economic choice, budgeting choice, how much do people cost. But I think it's important to note that as we're going through things, so. All right, gonna move along here, and I need to double check my script. Yep. Pull up the budget. Your next page should be the budget. This is the one that was approved on June 28th. just going down on the revenue portion at the top, and then I would recommend that you look at the far right-hand column, FY24, considered and approved June 28th. When the board approved this in June, they did it with some knowledge about the contributions from the 4 localities. So we received money from Goochland, from Hanover, from King and Queen, and from King William to operate both the branches in that individual localities area. So Goochland is paying to operate the Goochland branch. They do not pay to operate any part of the Alley branch or any part of the King and Queen branch, and that works across the various counties. State aid is usually about 10% of our budget, as you can see here. It's the next line down, $564,000. That varies, it goes up and it goes down. State aid is a state program. We've participated in it for 80 plus years. Every public library can qualify for that. It is advantageous to be in a regional library because your grant is quite a bit bigger. They reward you, if you will, for how large the area is and how much local contributions are. We are typically, I would say, in the top 5 recipients statewide for state aid. It's been a very important part of our funding. The other category, includes things like payments for fines, photocopies, printing, donations would be included in that. It varies from year to year, but we are basing this on, a kind of an approximate average. Expenditure refund is a program that we participate in. It's known as E-rate. We get reimbursed for the expenses that we put out for our internet connections to the branches. And that's a dollar amount that has become less and less over the years, in part because the cost of our connections has come down significantly. And then the last category is the reserve fund. And so you can see that we are budgeting $175,000 from the reserve fund to help cover expenses in FY24. On the expenses side, books and materials are an important part of the service that we provide. When people think of the public library, they typically think about books. We budget for continuing education for all of our staff. We have about $200,000 in contractual expenses budgeted. Contractual expenses are kind of what they sound like. There is a signed contract for a service. Equipment are going to be items that we purchase that are going to last longer than the fiscal year. Insurance, which I believe there was a question about early on, we budget and pay for insurance. That includes liability insurance. There's like an umbrella policy for the board. If you were to be sued I would say, I don't think you could get any money out of the insurance company if you were not sued, for a variety of reasons. Our motor vehicle insurance is included with that. We do have some cybersecurity coverage in that, and we have in the past had the carrier come and provide more information. We are with the Virginia Risk Management Association, I believe, VRSA, and that's basically a nonprofit made up of local government organizations, and they pool together to insure one another. Hanover uses the same method the town of Ashland does, town of West Point does. We do rent several of the facilities, moving down the road here. The Montpelier branch, which is, there's a replacement under construction in Hanover County, but we pay rent to the Montpelier Center for the Arts for that space. The Upper King William branch is also rented in King William, and we also pay rent for our administrative offices, which we leased and renovated a year and a half or so ago. And that, to go back up to the reserve fund, about $100,000 of the reserve fund is paying rent for the administrative offices. Our largest line, moving down, is salary and benefits. I'm gonna scroll up a little bit for the people in back. We have budgeted $4.2 million to be able to pay our staff. As I said, most of the staff are part-time. They do not have benefits. They do not accrue leave, et cetera. We made a large effort 2 fiscal years ago to improve our pay, partially in prep for, if there is a $15 an hour minimum wage coming in Virginia. But if you really look at what we did 2 years ago with a $12 minimum wage, and you just multiply out to where our salary should have increased to, we didn't actually increase them over that rate. They're still a little low from that. It was a very well thought out plan, I do think. All 4 localities, I should say all 3 localities, King and Queen did not particularly support it. They still did not fulfill our request, but the other 3 localities did. Supplies are things that we use up: toilet paper, copy paper, etc. We have $83,000 budgeted for covering our telephones, and utilities are $153,000. I'll tell you now, you'll see after you've been here a little bit, utility expenses vary as much at the library as they do at your home. Is it a warm year? Is it a cool year? They can swing significantly. So, and then our vehicle expenses, $14,000. Last thing I guess I will just note is that we have a balanced budget. Our total revenue and our total expenses are budgeted at the same amount. Are any questions arise from that quick overview?
Madam Chair, I have a question. I see that they balance because of the withdrawal from the reserve fund. Is any of that due to King and Queen withdrawing and the need for excess funds?
Can I clarify that? The 74,000?
Yeah.
No, none of that is.
Okay. Thank you.
Brief segue on the King and Queen plan, I guess, I will call it. I believe that King and Queen is going to remain with PRL basically at least through the end of the fiscal year, FY24. I don't believe that they're going to have their branch open the entire year, but when we make the request to the localities, there are a number of expenses that are covered in what we call the shared services piece of the operation. We share the collection, we share the technology, we share the vans and the staff that drive the vans around delivering the materials from branch to branch. I heard some conversation about that in the break. So that is the amount that you were kind of asking a question about, Ms. Schumacher, earlier with some of the division of things. Shared services, we have a budget for those, and we divide that based on a per capita basis with the localities. And I can tell you, I've said this before, when I got here, I'm looking at everything in hyper detail. I was here about 6 weeks, and I had counties calling and saying, can you tell me what's going to happen if we have to cut your budget 10% or 15%? The Great Recession was happening. So I'm really looking at everything, and did that for the first several years. But at the end of the day, Hanover ends up being about 70% of the operation. I wrote down my math just trying to do it. King and Queen's about 6, Goochland's about 14, and King William's about 10. Those are kind of off the top of my head. I can go back and look and see what we are specifically using. But again, they don't really change. And what I also found was that really none of the localities were interested in that being done on a year-to-year basis, on some sort of projection basis, because your numbers could swing back and forth, and it was just going to make all of our budget conversations be more difficult. It's one of the things that I've kind of suggested with the review of the contract, that maybe that's something that should be formalized, to say we're going to use, the census number from the decennial census, and we'll use that for the 10 years, just to kind of eliminate some of those questions. So, but thank you, that was a good question. Was there anything else on the budget? We've talked about the reserve fund already, briefly. That's the next sheet. The library, right now we are estimating that the library's reserve on 6/30/23, which would be the end of the fiscal year, will be about $3.1 million. And we'll need to talk about this likely in a finance committee meeting if we're going to have finance committee. But the board has to periodically redesignate the plan for the reserve fund. And that is in 5 categories that are set by GASB, the Government Accounting Standards Board. And they have definitions for what are in those categories. We do not have anything that is non-spendable or restricted or unassigned. The 2 categories that we do have are committed and assigned. In our committed category, we have $90,000 that has been committed for Atlee. We have $260,000 that are committed to Ashland. Those are basically gifts that we've received that need to be applied to these facilities. And so we're keeping track of them here in the reserve fund when we designate it. The board last year agreed to put $150,000 towards the renovations at West Point. So we were showing that as being committed, $150,000. And then the administration rent for FY24 is on here, and that's $96,600. So we've kind of committed to doing those. Assigned is not quite as rigid of a standard. And when we went into leasing the facility for the administrative offices, we have a 5-year lease from the time we took over the space, occupied the space. And we budgeted out with a 5-year plan in the designation of the reserve fund to be able to cover those expenses, knowing that it was going to be difficult to get another $100,000 out of the localities for really anything. But that was a good use of our reserve. And then you can see in the assigned category, the idea here is that we will acquire real estate to have our offices at. Whether we purchase an existing structure or we have something built, that has not been determined. But that's what the $1.7 million is there for. We don't have anything currently as a future branch capital project, but we have set a precedent where we do sometimes contribute to the local funding for a branch. So we contributed money to Hanover for this building, indeed, because we had it in the reserve fund, and it was a legitimate need. You all decided to go ahead and do that. It's possible that you'll do that again. Future admin rent, I've got $300,000 there. I said it was a 5-year lease, so we've got to pay it this year, but we also have a lease obligation for 3 more years after that. And then we have $500,000 in unanticipated expenses, so. Okay. Were there any questions about this?
Madam Chair, I have a question. Future admin capital project, is that something that a previous board had voted on?
Previously, the library board has voted and contributed to expenses like that, yes.
But I mean, there's an assigned line item here of $1,748,087.
That's,
That's being held where?
so, sort of one at a time. And maybe I misheard you, but your first question was about the future branch capital project.
No, I'm talking about the administration.
Both
capital
of
project.
these are about the future admin capital project. Yeah, okay.
Okay, so I'm assuming that would be a building for administration?
It is,
For your
would be.
offices?
Mhm.
And I just don't know, did a board in the past vote to allot and appropriate reserve fund money for a future capital project?
So there's a difference between designating the reserve fund and appropriating funds to be spent.
Right,
So this is a plan. No money can be spent from this plan. The library board would have to have a vote to appropriate that money for that expense.
right. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. In other words, the board voted to, or did the board vote to just have almost $2 million sitting somewhere for a future project that may or may not happen? Is that correct? I'm just trying to understand. And if so, does any of this money, is it excess funds from the counties, the contributing counties, that they may or may not wish to have? If there's excess funds, do they know that their funds have gone into a reserve fund? Or might they want to have the opportunity to get, return some of their money to the county taxpayers? I don't understand how almost $2 million can be sitting in an account that is not accounted for on any of the board reports that I saw.
Well, the board report is talking about your operating budget for the current fiscal year.
Right.
Which is different from like the audit, which accounts for other resources that the library has. So, I mean, you're correct. They don't cross, but they're not intended to.
I
Right.
understand operating versus these expenses, but
Yes.
in all the kind of studying I did, I didn't see anything until minutes from 2022. I saw the first mention of a reserve fund, and then when I got wind of the fact that it was up in the millions, I thought, well, did this money come from, I know it comes from donations, various sources, none of which I understood really until, I haven't seen an accounting of where the money's come from. But it seems to me that there's a large chunk of this money that is taxpayer money. And I think that there needs to be acknowledgement that almost $2 million is sitting in a fund waiting for a project that the board hasn't really approved or voted on, that I understand. And maybe I'm missing something greatly here, but it just seems like a lot of money.
Well, okay, so to back up, we didn't go out and sign a lease for the admin offices or for the Upper King William branch or for the Montpelier branch without having had board approval for those,
Of course.
right? So we had all of those discussions at the time about that we were going to use the reserve fund for those purposes. In the past, the library board has voted and appropriated money from the reserve fund to keep the local request to the localities flat. Coming out of the pandemic, we did that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, we have a plan, which is what this is, to help return that to the localities, if you will. All of it is public money. Whether a citizen has given us $250,000 from their estate, or whether the Board of Supervisors has voted and approved funding the library for this amount.
I guess that I would submit that perhaps in a year where there is an excess of funds, that it be accountable or accounted for such that I believe that each county board should be made aware, this portion of your funds were excess funds. Should we put it in our reserve fund for this future admin capital project, or shall we return it to you and the taxpayers of Goochland, Kingway, or whatever?
So sort of legally, the money stays with the library. The library is a political subdivision of the county, of the state, Commonwealth of Virginia, pardon me. And so whatever is left at the end of the year sort of is by definition surplus. That is correct. We are running a regional system, and so there really isn't a way to say, well, we didn't spend these $12 that Goochland gave us, so we're giving you the $12 back. That would be a lot of accounting to be sure that that was going to be accurate information. The reserve fund is not a secret. All of the localities know about it. They also have their own reserve funds, right?
Oh, I don't doubt,
Yep.
I just hadn't seen a thing about it.
And the idea here, well, that's just sort of a level, I guess, probably of interaction with a governing body like this. But part of the reason why we have this historically is that if you have a need, you have some resources that you're able to draw upon to cover that need. We used to have a bookmobile. We carried the reserve fund for that in case we needed to do something major with the bookmobile or replace it. We have a number of vehicles. If we didn't have the reserve fund and we had a car accident, we would have to figure out a different way of funding that,
I fully
right?
acknowledge the need
Yep.
for a reserve fund is a
So-
good thing. I just saw $1.7 million sitting aside for a future project that may or may not happen, and I don't know where it resides, who's managing the money,
So
how that
That's
all-
a separate question, and the reserve funds that the library holds are held as part of the reserve with Hanover County. They're invested as a proportional amount with the investments that Hanover County makes. So they're managed by the Hanover County Treasurer.
Okay.
And generally speaking, you can't go and put public funds in your T. Rowe Price mutual fund. You can't go out and buy shares of Apple. It's very defined.
Oh, yeah.
You have to put things, you have to invest in things that are very stable. Hanover County has a large enough reserve that they have a few more options, but basically they are also bound to those same criteria.
Okay. Well, thank you.
So, I don't have screens for the next few sections, but we're moving into our policies. Approving policy is definitely the job of the library board. First policy that I have is our personnel policies. As I said, we've got 135 people. We hire, we supervise, coach. Occasionally we have to have a separation. People have all kinds of different situations, jury duty, military leave, et cetera. I'm not going to go through these. I'm going to welcome you to read them at your level of interest outside of the meeting. If you have a copy of them, feel free to let me know if you have questions on those. The next section are our library policies. And I'll just sort of note briefly on that, the first item on the library policies, this is how we govern our service for the public. and you'll see that item 1 is confidentiality of library circulation records. And that was what Mr. Walter was talking about. There are not very many call-outs in the Freedom of Information Act, but one of them is for libraries and those library records. A record saying, Tom Shepley checked out this book is a private record.
Or any user of the library.
Any user of the library.
Any user of the library.
So, but we use these policies, which you approve, and procedures which are developed and evolve over time at the staff level in providing services. The next section after that are part of the library policies, but they haven't been kind of integrated into it in terms of a book or a format, and that is the collection development policy, the library sponsored programs policy, and the library displays policy. And those are policies that the board approved this past fiscal year to help update and clarify based upon questions from the public about how we operate. And that happens from time to time. We certainly try to keep things up to date. The next section, we have financial policies. You can see that there is a section in here about the audit policy, accounting policy here on the first page. We don't have a ton of updates with the financial policies, and a lot of the financial policies are controlled differently now because we're in the same financial system as Hanover County. We used to be in QuickBooks. The library board made that decision 4 or 5 years ago.
I'm sorry, did you say use QuickBooks?
We did.
Oh, okay, I just didn't hear you. Thank you.
Yep. Which was fine. If you have specific questions about our financial operations, happy to address those, or happy to give you an overview of those at a future meeting as well.
Chairman, Madam Chairman, can I ask a question? Could we clarify what the policy is for getting in a point on the agenda? What is the proper policy if we do want to come back and discuss some of these things? Are we to send that to you, Madam Chair, or whoever is serving as chair? Or do we send that to Mr. Shepley, or both, or how do we?
Madam Chair, I think probably not today, but I think sometime in the very near future, you should have a session here where you're able to talk about some of that.
Okay.
So you're not having that discussion online, but to talk and have a better idea what people's priorities are. I can work to try to send out a survey that we could then share back. Maybe that would help to narrow the amount of time
Yeah.
here, but let me make a note of that. Not quite through the policies. Next section, safety and motor vehicle policies. We do have a number of people who drive library vehicles or their own personal vehicles, which also creates some liability for us. And so we have some policies to make sure that we have done driver record reviews. We don't have somebody who's, driving without a license or, something else crazy. Make sure we're operating correctly. Those are located there. Last month, the board, well, not last month, but last meeting, did pass the FOIA policy, and that is the one that says rights and responsibilities up at the top. So, and again, those will need to get merged into a better working format here moving forward. Policies have never been put on the library's website before this year. It just wasn't a need. Nobody particularly cared or asked questions about them. It's not that we were hiding anything, it's just didn't really have the need. So again, we'll be working on some formatting for that. I don't think the format, the container that it is in, takes away from the policy that you passed. Those are kind of two separate functions. But a lot about policies. Are there kind of overview questions on policies?
Madam Chair, I have a
Yes.
question. I just, real quick, so these right here are not posted currently. I know that the ones we passed in March are, I've seen those, but these are not up there.
The ones in March and the FOIA policy
Right.
have been posted. These others haven't. Quite honestly, the container that they have existed in has been a fairly complicated, heavily formatted, older Word document. And of course, we are needing to put things up as PDFs or a different file format. And just kind of getting that together has been more work than we've been able to do. Yeah. I think, although we didn't print them in color, like the library collection policy has more of an updated format. So we have some visual cues as we're going through things, working these, for I would say sort of the next few fiscal years, we can update all of the policies. We'll have a visual cue to say, oh yeah, that's when we need to hit. So able to do all of that. Any others? Thank you. Our next section is going to be library performance measures. And first thing I would like to talk about, you have one sheet that I did not put in. It's got some color on it.
This one?
Yeah, so I'm going to pull that up. Sort of the many questions that have been asked by the public recently. This is a comparison chart. I've benchmarked PRL against some of our neighboring regional library systems and then our neighboring kind of county systems or municipal systems. Central Rappahannock is headquartered in Fredericksburg. I assume everyone knows where Chesterfield County is, and Henrico County. Jefferson-Madison is headquartered in Charlottesville and serves that area. Pamunkey Regional Library and the Richmond Public Library underneath that. And then finally, Williamsburg Public Regional Library. Kind of historically, Central Rappahannock, Jefferson-Madison, and Williamsburg are what I would consider to be highly performing regional public libraries, and they're close to us. So they make good benchmark folks here. I've entered the circulation as reported to the state for 2018, 2019, 2020, 21, and 22. You'll see the year change, so like between 2019 and 2020, that year change is between 2018 and 2019. And then moving forward, you can do every year, but you have to have 2 years to be able to have a comparison. And then the last two columns that are in color, I'm gonna start at the bottom. You can see the minus 17%. So collectively, the libraries had a decrease in circulation of 17% from 2018 to 2022. Central Rappahannock has had, as you can see, some bigger swings, down 37% with the pandemic, up 30% last year. So averaging their changes, they had a minus 10% average and a 31% decrease overall. Chesterfield averaged no change year to year. Theirs averages out to 0. And they come up with a 6% increase over the time period. Henrico has a net decrease of 8%, well, not net decrease, 8% average, and a net decrease of 32% over the time frame. And Jefferson-Madison is also down slightly, 3% on average and 5% from 18 to 22. PRL averaged a 2% increase, and we are up 9% over the same time frame. Richmond averaged 1% increase over the time frame, and they have a 17% change in 2018 to 22. Williamsburg down 1% on the average and down 2% overall. I think what I would probably offer you as your takeaways are that it's tough if you have a 37% decrease, obviously. We were down that year as well, 13%. It's just that you have to kind of look at this stuff, I think, both over time and then kind of what's going on with our peers. And from my evaluation of this, I would suggest that we're not performing too terribly bad. We are in the green in both categories.
Can I ask a very
Yep.
basic question? The definition of circulation, is that units checked out? Is it patrons? What is it?
So it is the items that are checked out or
Items that are checked
renewed.
out.
Mhm.
Okay.
It includes any materials that are borrowed, whether they're borrowed physically, you come in with your library card and you take a book home with you, or if you're using our online electronic
Hoopla,
systems.
Libby, those
Mhm.
things? Okay.
Yep,
Okay, thank you.
so,
Madam Chair, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a breakout based on what is print with people actually coming in and physically getting books and what is digital?
I have that for PRL, I do not have that for the other systems.
Okay. And just to clarify, you said that it also includes renewal. So
It
if
does.
somebody takes a book out and then renews it, I think, is it 2 times you can renew it? That would count as 3 circulations, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Thank you.
Some of the library systems have gone to being fine-free, and I can't speak to all of these, but if libraries that have done that typically have an automatic renewal policy as well, so they are automatically counting some circs.
Indefinitely, or?
They would define that by their policy. Yeah, so I can't exactly address that. I know that some of the positive increase in the other systems is likely attributable to that,
Okay.
but yeah. Digital is definitely increasing at a faster rate than physical, but our physical is still on the increase. We've not hit a plateau and are seeing declines on that, but that's a frequent question. I've been doing this for 30 years, and the conversation has always been, well, the internet, the electronic, it's all gonna replace.
Yeah.
It hasn't happened yet, so, but thank you. So, like I said, I think we're doing, kind of okay. I always cringe if I have to come to you and say, well, we did something different, and we're saving 30%. It costs 30% less, because that tells me that we should have done something and made that change when it was only a 10% difference or 5%, right? A large decrease, a large increase. I don't think that's necessarily the best, and I guess I would, if I need to convince you about that, do you want to see those kinds of swings in your mutual fund, as I mentioned before, where it's going up and down, or would you like to see steady increases? So I think that we've been able to manage this, fairly decent on circulation. I'm going to continue on here. These are draft statistics, which should be your next document. We have a very kind of basic annual statistical report. If you go down towards the bottom, we have system-wide totals. System-wide, we are showing a slight increase, 5,000 active borrowers. We have people registering for cards, new borrowers. That's just like a routine business, but we do count it. We're looking at some of those numbers and making sure that all the right statistical pieces are capturing that information correctly. In FY23 here, we have seen an increase in visitors. People are coming back to the libraries. It has not returned to pre-pandemic levels, which I think is interesting when you come down and look at circulation, because our circulation has been increasing, and Overall, this is the 4th year in a row where we've had, I should do it your way, but trending upward. Our circulation has been returning since it dropped initially with the pandemic and when we were closed. You can see that people are not asking as many questions as they used to. We do a section here, breakdown by each of the localities. I'm going to continue to slide. If you go to the second page, we have what we would call our PRL dashboard. And this is just kind of a visual way of showing you some of the information here. So at this point I'm sorry, this is not the overall one, this is Goochland. They're in alphabetical order and PRLs at the end. So Goochland circulation was very nearly flat. They had a huge increase in visits, huge increase in new borrowers. And we just do these as a routine course, these dashboards. So you'll be receiving them in the future. Hanover had a larger return in terms of CERC, larger return in visits, not quite as many new borrowers. King and Queen has been kind of problematic for us for a good number of years. Their numbers are generally really small numbers, and so you can see like their library visits, the speedometer, if you will, is way off the chart, pointing down, because they had a 3,000 increase in their visits. Percentage-wise, it's that large, but it's a smaller number. It's just kind of the way numbers work. It's been hard to provide that service. We're very limited in the number of hours that they have been able to cover. They are somewhere around 32 hours right now, and we're at 64 hours in Goochland. That's the branch that's open the most per week. The more you're open, the more people can use you. You'll see if we do have the meeting at King and Queen, it is quite literally in the cornfield. We don't really have a bean field this year. Thank you. Miss Simpkins lives across the street, so she knows. But you know, how easy is the location to get to, et cetera, that all matters. So, King William numbers, they're down slightly on their CERC from year to year on the projection. Visits were up, new borrowers were up. And then overall, you add it all together. This was a year where everybody had, in total, we had the needle off. It was over 100%, so we're kind of making some progress. Are there questions about the stats before we move on? Okay. We're going to slide into planning. It is the library board's job to plan, to kind of touch on the previous questions about designation of the reserve fund. That is part of the planning process. Some plans are short-term, some plans are longer-term, and the document here is the library board year, and there are just routine things that end up having to happen every year. Every July you have your organizational meeting. You have to restart that. You have new folks join the board. Some folks have left. So these are some things that typically will happen at the beginning of the year. You can see that normally we have a meeting in July, not in August. That was a change that was made this year. September has audit. October has the budget request. Staff will bring you our ideas for what needs to happen with the budget for you to approve. We have a discussion about that. It feels like that happens early and earlier. Just so you know, I mean, you have to develop a budget in advance of the first locality that has a due date for us, and there's generally about a 3-4 month time frame for when the budgets have to be submitted between the 4 counties. So November and December, we have one meeting usually at the early part of December, trying to avoid holiday conflicts. January, always good for a little review, how the year has been working. February, we start to look at, are there going to be vacancies, and are there folks that we might seek to have appointed, recommend, suggest. In March, we have to put in an application to receive state aid for the next year. April, overview on the budget. May, adopt. And June is the end of the year, and you're looking back and reviewing. We have had a cycle suggested at the bottom, which is for the review of policies. So that can be something that we take a look at as we're planning ahead. I'm going to keep moving here. The next document is the long-range plan for the library. And you can see we did this. It was dated FY16 to FY20. And then you have a pandemic. Had a lot of turnover in library board members as well through the pandemic. And even still today, I mean, you can say that we're not really through all of the ripple effects of what has happened to the world related to the pandemic, but it is time that we need to turn some focus back and work on a long-range plan, and that's a fairly significant investment in your time to be able to do that. But I do believe it's time. And that's where we kind of come back to what we're going to work on meeting by meeting as we go through the year here. So, the long-range plan was developed in the middle teens, and I will say that we had a long tail on the Great Recession. We continue to have budget cuts happening. You think, oh, we're having the Great Recession, and all 4 localities can have the same problems at the same years. It's not how it works, or it didn't work for us that way. I think everybody took their turn. We got a taste of cuts from Hanover, from Goochland, from King William. King and Queens we've had more than one bite at that apple, unfortunately. But we adopted this in light of what was happening then, and resources being so tight, and the decision was to kind of segment our branches on these experiences that our customers had. And then we worked to make sure that we were improving the branches along the lines of the various categories. So some of you are familiar with some of our smaller branches. We call those community hubs. Rockville, Hanover, Montpelier, King and Queen all fit that category. And they are what they sound like. They are a hub in the community wherever they are, and their services are pretty kind of well defined. And we have other branches, one-stops. The Atlee branch is a one-stop branch. Mechanicsville, Ashland, Mechanicsville, did I already say that? Sorry. And so, as a for instance, when we're buying a new book, well, we try to buy books that people want. It might sound sort of common sense, but you don't know that someone's going to take that book off the shelf, right? So I can put that book on the shelf at King and Queen, and it may never check out because their traffic is so low and their hours are so poor. I can put the same book on the shelf here or at Mechanicsville, and I won't say it's a guarantee. I would say you have a 90% chance that it will go out the door just because of its location and sort of the breadth of the interests of the readers at that location. We had some, Goochland, Upper King William, and West Point, their usage patterns were just different. And one of the ways that they were different was that they kind of had all the things of the community hub, but they clearly had audiences that were coming in to work, use the internet, either use our computer, use your laptop, etc. And also people who were using it for more entertainment, not necessarily sort of the community piece, but they might have been attending programs, meeting friends, etc. And so when we did this, we came up with different goals and different things to do. So like we've purchased new furniture at some of the branches, and we've tried to do some other rearrange and keep things updated. But it was a plan that reflected the times that we had been working through. And the world's a lot different today than it was in the middle teens. So again, it's time to move forward with that. So, I think in your binder, you should have a census document. And it is just basic demographics from the Census Bureau for the 4 localities. It gives you a pretty easy way to eyeball differences in whatever you want to see that they're counting. Persons under the age of 5, or how many Native Hawaiians we have. We don't seem to have a lot of Native Hawaiians, so. But wanted to be able to provide some basic demographics for you. I'm sure we'll refer to those as we go. Kind of a part of planning and part of resources for you all. One of the things that I kind of chose not to do based on how much we could stuff into the notebook, we did not provide you with minutes from the last year. If anybody needs those, wants those printed, I'm happy to provide them for you. If you go to the library's website, we've added a new tab on the green bar about PRL. And there is a section for the Library Board of Trustees. There is a directory of the former board members. I'm going to be updating that with your contact info that I just asked you about to help folks contact you if they need to. Meeting schedule for FY24 is here. And then as you can see here, we kind of annotate the calendar of events, the calendar for the library board meetings with documents that we should be discussing at the meeting. So good places to find things. And then FY23 is also available on there, and all the minutes, the board financial reports and the warrants are available there. So,
Madam Chair, could I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering if Monkey Regional Library has any historical documents about things that have happened in the past or that boards have agreed to in the past, even beyond the fiscal years that are posted there, that are helpful in moving forward. Specifically, just to give an example, I've asked a couple of people what the purpose of the executive committee is, because there is no fleshing out of that at all in the bylaws. And my understanding was that that was decided at a meeting a long time ago. But how do new board members have access to those kind of decisions that were made that affect the way that we operate?
I'm going to say that I think you're going to have to ask for it. I mean, we do have records of the minutes. We don't have them online, and I don't really think that it's worth the effort to try to retrospectively put things online on these past decisions when you really need a meeting or two.
Yeah.
I agree with you on that, and also on the bylaws needing to clarify what we're going to do with this executive committee.
Okay.
So yeah, be glad to. Can you make a note to help me remember that one? But that is the intention there. So hopefully, in a few years we'll have that body and it will be here. But we'll have to look and see what we can do. One of the other things that you have in your book is this document called Planning for Library Excellence from the Library of Virginia. I've had comments from some of you about making the library be the best that it can be. This is a document that you can use to measure yourselves, measure the library. We can work through this as a process if you choose to do so. This is a relatively new document, 2019. A number of librarians across the state worked on it, and it gives you good guidance about pretty much every area of the operation. So you wouldn't have to do it all at once. You can break it down, do a chunk a quarter or something like that. But I think you should take a look through this. And I would kind of suggest don't kind of go running off on your own doing this. There's some other documents that go with this that would help you to measure it that I would suggest we provide. But I'm happy to do that as that becomes a board priority. I'm going to have to step away real quick, but I'll talk louder. Related to that, if you could just pass this on, is the Public Library Trustee Handbook for Governing Boards. Some of you have been here long enough that you've gotten this twice, maybe 3 times. But it really does remain, I would sort of say that's the gold standard. It's a great place to go for questions. If you have questions after reading that, I would suggest that you probably want to come back to me to say, how does something work? But it is full of great info, and I do think we've got, plenty to do as we move forward here in planning for the future of PRL. And we know we've got a lot of changes happening, so should be pretty exciting to do that. I am going to take a brief minute and talk about library associations. Librarians have worked together collectively in associations. There's a Virginia Library Association. There's an American Library Association. There is a Public Library Association that is a division of the American Library Association. And I bring these up. I know there's going to be some questions about it, and I think that's fine for you to have your discussion on that. But I want to kind of remind you that these associations have been doing the work of libraries for decades, sometimes centuries, and they are huge resources of information about how to provide great library service. And I think you want to be able to have that network available to you. And I'm going to kind of leave the discussion at that from my perspective. So, I gave you the demographics. I do have a sheet. I'm going to just talk briefly. We have a lot of friends from Goochland on this side of the room. Oh, this side too. I'm sorry, everybody. Maybe you sat in different spots. Sorry about that. Welcome. Glad to have you. In the past, one of the things that the board has done at these meetings has been to kind of talk about liaisons. Our Goochland representatives, there are 2 of them, and they have 1 branch. In Hanover, you have 6 branches and 4 members. So obviously, you got to have a little bit different approach as we go. A couple of the friends groups have become inactive at the Hanover branch. They really weren't able to keep up and attract people, and so they've become inactive. And the Rockville Friends have also dissolved. So we're currently with 8 friends groups. Typically, they are some form of nonprofit. They are a separate organization, but important. Important to the library and important to the members that are trying to support and improve their local branches. So I want to give them some credit and thanks here today. So, but that is pretty much my last tab. Yeah, that was the Planning for Excellence document. Any other questions? And I'll get out of your way and you can get on with the rest of your meeting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for, Tom, also thank you for having Dennis here. That was a very good presentation that he was able to give us all.
I knew you didn't want to listen to either of us for the entire time.
Hey, I stayed awake through an attorney talking. What are you talking about?
Okay.
We're now gonna move on to unfinished business. First
That's new
thing,
business, not unfinished business.
unfinished, it's
New
not
business.
old,
Old business, old
it's
business.
unfinished.
Unfinished, okay.
Last time we met, the Personnel Committee presented the slate of officers for the coming 24 fiscal year. So we're gonna vote on that today, okay? It was, well, do I have to do another motion for it?
I'm sorry?
Do we need to do another motion for the officers?
I don't think so.
Yeah, we have to
think
vote
so.
on it.
Yeah, just vote.
Is it voted by individual officer, or is it as a block of officers?
As a, normally it's
No, it's as a
presented
block.
as a, it
As a
comes from the
slate.
committee as a slate.
Yeah, so we just vote on
I'm
the
sorry,
whole
I can't,
thing.
who am I speaking to?
I just asked if it would,
Oh,
I just
I
asked.
didn't know
if
who I
we-
was speaking
I
to
just
there.
asked if we
Sorry,
voted as individual officers or as a block of officers.
Normally, it was
It's a
presented
block,
at a
usually.
committee as a block, if,
Okay.
you know, if you want. That's how it was presented from committee.
Yeah. Okay,
Can you read the slate?
sure. We have Chair Mary Shipman, Vice Chair Joe O'Connor, Treasurer Tom Shipley, and Secretary Barbara Young.
Madam Chair, could
Yes,
I
ma'am.
make a motion that we split the block and vote individually on these nominations and take nominations from the floor as well?
Well, the Personnel Committee is the one that presents
Present a recommendation.
recommendation. Yeah.
I'll second Christie's motion for discussion.
Okay. Okay, how would you like it split?
Based on office.
Each one?
Mhm.
Okay, sure. All right, well, let's vote on chairperson first.
Well, we gotta vote on Christie's motion.
Oh, okay. All right. Christie's made the motion, we vote individually for each office for the slate next year. Tom and Ryan seconded. So all in favor?
I cannot hear you.
Okay.
What was?
We're voting to just do each office individually.
Okay,
And take nominations from the floor. I
And
added
then
to my motion. That
take
was part of
nominations from
my
the
original
floor.
motion.
okay, so that's, the vote is not to take the slate.
Right,
Okay, thank you.
okay. All in favor of Christie's motion? Aye.
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 All opposed? Okay. All right, let's start with the chair.
So we can take, I'm just trying to understand, so now we're gonna take nominations from the floor, based on
Are
what
we
we
gonna
just
take
passed.
nominations before?
In addition
just
to
the,
who's already been nominated by the committee. So you
that's
have
part
a
of it.
nomination for Mary Shipman. The question is are there other nominations?
I'd like, Madam Chair, I'd like to nominate Barbara Young from Goochland for chair.
Okay.
Point of order, Madam Chair, does a nomination require a second?
Yes,
Yes.
since it's not from a committee, yes.
I second the motion for Barb Young as chair.
Okay.
I'm really
All
having
right,
difficulty
they've
here.
nominated Barb Young for chair.
Okay.
Madam Chair, maybe just a reminder to have folks use the microphones to
Okay.
help.
We're not used to having all this modern stuff. Okay. All right, let's vote on, I don't know. We don't, all right, we have to vote on Barb's nomination, right?
No, they're nominated. They're both
Okay,
nominated.
nominated.
All I did was
So the
nominate.
vote would be whether or not to vote in favor of
Mary
Mary or
or
in favor of.
Barbara?
So-
Okay, okay. All in favor of Mary Shipman being chair, say aye.
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 Okay.
Do a roll call.
Oh, well, that might be that, okay. Let's do a roll call vote.
Okay. I will start with Bob.
And this is voting for,
We voted to see Mary Shipman as chair.
As chair. Bob?
how did Mary Shipman?
No.
Do you vote for one of the two? Either,
You have to choose
Oh,
a
you
name.
select the name.
Yeah, we're actually
Right,
doing
you
the
do it that
names now. It's a roll call.
I would like to have Barbara Young be the chairman.
Okay, Barbara?
You pick who you want. I select Barbara Young.
Okay. Joe?
We need
We've
Dennis.
never done
That's not how you vote.
Joe,
I'm just.
Joe, you
Well,
can't
I
do it.
was
I'm just
asking.
telling, that's not how you vote. You vote one at a time. You don't, this is not an election.
There's
yeah.
a couple of ways of doing it, Joe. This is an acceptable manner.
This is an acceptable.
This is an acceptable
Okay.
manner to do it.
Okay.
Just vote for which of the two you want.
How do you
Okay,
vote?
okay. Mary Shipman.
Mary?
Mary, you,
Mary?
Vote for
Okay, I'll
yourself?
vote for myself.
Okay.
Okay, Tricia?
Mary?
And Ryan?
Barbara Young.
And John?
Mary?
And Christie?
Barbara Young.
And and me, I will vote for myself.
Okay.
So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for Barbara Young and 1, 2, 3, 4 for Mary.
Okay, our new chair, congratulations, Barbara Young. Okay, are there any nominations for the vice chair besides Joe O'Connor?
I would like to nominate Ryan Martin as vice chair.
Okay,
I'll second that.
okay. Let's have a roll call vote.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
since I obviously cannot get a unanimous vote from my colleagues after 32 years of service to Hanover County, I withdraw my name from nomination.
Okay. So I guess we just, all right, let's vote on Ryan.
Are there
And
any
do
other
we need
nominations?
to vote? Well, yeah, we have to accept him.
No, you gotta, I don't think there may be other nominations.
Are there other nominations for the vice chair? Okay. Being no other nominations, all in favor of Ryan, vote aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Congratulations, Ryan, you're our new vice chair. Okay, treasurer, Tom Shepley. Any nominations other than Tom?
Could I ask a point of order question?
Sure.
I understand that's an information question. Is that correct, Mr. Edwards? What is why has it happened historically that the treasurer of the board is the library director? Since this is a board treasurer, does it not make sense that the treasurer is a member of the board?
It can be, but doesn't have to be. Hanover County, their staff is actually managing our finances, the day-to-day, writing the checks and doing it and so forth. And the treasurer would be our representative.
Could he speak up? I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Microphone.
Tom, did I explain that adequately?
We couldn't hear you.
They couldn't hear you.
Hello?
So,
I hate
so
these things.
library staff are still managing the finances. We're using tools that Hanover County manages in effect. But, Hanover County does not enter our bills for payment. That is something that we do, and that approval process is with us. The treasurer has been the library director for decades at this point because we're the person that is supervising what happens with the funds. I don't believe that a board member would really have the ability to do that. I would kind of suggest, related to the Board of Supervisors, they don't have a treasurer either. The localities have a treasurer that is a full-time employee, usually elected, but that's historic.
Madam
Chair,
Yes.
in our bylaws, on the second page, number 3, officers, E, the treasurer shall have charge of the library funds and shall make available a monthly report to the board and on the state of the funds. The treasurer of the board, the library director, is authorized to sign invoices in approval for a payment. In the absence of the treasurer, any 2 officers of the board are authorized to sign. So that's what's in the bylaws.
Madam Chair, may I ask for another point of order?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Edwards, you mentioned that it can be done either way. Do you see that reading of the bylaws, obviously you're not a lawyer, as an either or do we see that as one is the other?
I said it's done either way, various governing bodies.
Okay.
I support Tom continuing to be the treasurer.
Another point of order. There's a finance committee that's being in discussions about starting up. Are there any parameters for what that financial committee will be looking at, what authority they have, what responsibility they have in overseeing what kind of invoices are signed and budgeting strategy and those kind of things?
We're just getting the finance committee restarted. In fact, John's going to be appointed the chairperson of that.
Maybe, depends on this organization. The discussion
It'll be
has
up to
been
him.
to assist in making sure that others better understand
Yeah.
the budget, helping the director and his staff prepare a budget to bring to the board each year. Previous member of this board thought it was a priority. The board discussed it and voted to establish the committee.
Finance back, yeah. Okay.
But as with the personnel and the executive committee, they have no power of action on their own. It all comes back to this board for action. They're to help research,
Research,
provide information,
provide
guidance,
suggestions.
suggestions to the board, yes.
Sorry, I have another point of order question. So the treasurer of the board, what is exactly their job description? Are they just the liaison between staff who are working on putting together budgets and warrant lists and documents and just presenting it to the board? Is that their job?
Treasurer of the
Or
board.
are they actively involved in the day-to-day stuff? Obviously, Mr. Shepley has carried both roles. He is the director of the Pamunkey Regional Library. He is the treasurer of the board. And I'm asking, where is that line between what are his responsibilities as project director when it comes to finance, and what are the responsibilities that he takes over as treasurer of the board?
Well, as director, he is directly involved with the cost of running PRL, where I'm not, I'm sure you're not, Ryan. Do you know all the ins and outs of financing PRL? So I think that's how, and it was in the bylaws that what the treasurer does. And it's kind of stipulated that it should be the director because of his knowledge.
Madam
Yeah.
Chair, may I?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I think there seems to be a little confusion because of the fact that it's a little unusual for the treasurer of this board to also be the board's employee. It just, something about it is a little amiss. And what I think, perhaps we could, it could be just the title that is confusing us. Clearly, this board does not get involved in the day-to-day activities of running the library, the PRL. That's why we have a library director. I think what we are kind of trying to edge toward is a way for the board to be a more active, play a more active role in developing the financial policies and such and the day-to-day activities as a direct, to working more directly with the director and getting maybe more information, more detailed information from what I'm guessing might be a finance committee. So to me, it's a little confusing to have the library director be the treasurer, though he's fulfilling all the responsibilities of somebody who has to manage the payment of the bills, the payroll, all that. That's his job. So what we need to do as a board, I think, is maybe perhaps there's talk of a finance committee regenerating to be more involved in the financials of the running of the PRL and working with the director. And so I don't know that having a board treasurer, nobody seems to be able to truly define what that means. What I'm hearing and what I'm suggesting is perhaps we have a finance committee who works in dovetail with the library director, and it's a symbiotic relationship where the board is leading the way in the finances. So that's it's a little confusing, but that's kind of how I see it.
Yes, Madam Chair. I would agree with everything that Ms. Sloan just said. We are a volunteer board. We are asking a volunteer to take on a lot more responsibility than a volunteer can do. And I have served on a lot of different volunteer boards in Hanover County and outside of Hanover County, and a volunteer is never the treasurer of the organization. And that's what we're at. That's what this could lead to. There needs to be a better definition. Tom is the director, quite often it's called a CEO. Usually the CEO would have a financial director, but that's not what we have here. It's government, It's a lot of responsibility to give to a volunteer. And for that volunteer, it's a full-time job. I know we want to have more insight, but I don't think this is the way we get it. This could be a disaster. Yes. I'm sorry, I shouldn't recognize you. The chair should recognize you. I'm sorry.
I'd like to share some information, and it's, again, from
Speaking to
my experience, again, of running a nonprofit.
Yeah, there you
A
go.
nonprofit is not exactly the same as a public board. But in my case, I handled upwards of between $3 and $4 million in this nonprofit. I did have a treasurer on my board. I also had a finance department in my organization. And there was a relationship through a finance committee between the two. My board was a voluntary board. They came, I did not, it was all on their own bill. And we would travel all over the world in many respects. But I am tending to really try to appreciate what Joe is saying. It is a lot of work, but don't underestimate an individual in their ability to want to participate in this kind of a discussion like Barbara was mentioning here. I think that they have a responsibility to understand better the finances and work within the board, and then working with the director, me, and trying to instruct me through my staff on how to expend resources, or apportion resources for the benefit of what that director needs.
Okay. Donald?
Madam Chair, so I would suggest that the title is mostly honorific. I mean, you do not actually have a job description, correct? I don't think that it changes what I or staff do. I think that you might find it difficult to make a trustee treasurer, given the operating, I'm going to call them circumstances with Hanover. So I think if you don't have a description, then we can't really be making a change. If you wish to not fill that office at this point in time, develop a description of how you think the board thinks this should work on a different basis, then you could take that position description that you might develop, and we can sort of send that up the flagpole and see if it has merit or not. Traditionally, the treasurer has control of the finances, and the board has delegated that really to the Hanover County treasurer as it relates to the reserve fund. That was not the case, a few years ago. And if you look back historically, the library board would have gotten together and they would have approved the expenditures. The treasurer would have written checks at the meeting. They would have been signed. They would have gone out. That's not really the way the world works today. A lot of these things are kind of historical. I don't want to say relic, but that's sort of what comes to mind. When the board is approving the payments have already had to go out. We followed your direction as it related when you made the budget. If you had questions about these various expenses, that was the time to ask them in the budgeting process. I think that's true of pretty much every one of the localities at this point in time. But if you want to look into that further, then why don't you pass by it today, and we'll come to consensus on what it is the board is trying to do, and we'll move forward on that in the future.
Okay. So is there a motion to not vote on the treasurer today and come up with a job description, say by next month? Or handle it talk about it next month?
I will make that motion.
Okay, good.
I'll second it.
All in favor?
No,
Okay. All opposed?
no.
Okay, thank you. Well, the ayes have it. So we will discuss the position of treasurer at a later date. Our next,
Did you, in the motion though, did you say it will come, that we'll come back with a description
Of
by
the
next month
yeah,
and vote on it next month?
Yeah.
Is that the case? It's not in the future, it's next month?
next month, yeah,
Okay, good.
next
okay.
month. Because we can't let this just keep going on
Right,
and on.
exactly. I agree, I agree.
Yeah. Okay, the last position is for secretary. Any nominations?
I would like to, Madam Chair, remove my name.
Okay. All right. Now, the floor is open for nominations for secretary.
Madam Secretary, Chairman, I would like to nominate Christy Schumacher for that position. I've seen the work that she's done with regard to her skill and able to listen and record in her own notes, and her ability to make presentations to a group like this, and I think that she would be an excellent candidate for the job.
Okay,
I second.
all right. John, do you want to bring up about having a staff member take notes?
I can. It was my recommendation at the last meeting
Yeah.
that all four of the regional boards I sit on and the governing body I work for all have a staff meeting due. Excuse me. The
Staff
other
member.
three regional boards I sit on and the governing body I work for all have a staff member maintain the minutes, record each meeting, and prepare the minutes for approval. So I have no objection to Ms. Schumacher being the secretary. I personally find it difficult to take notes and participate in a meeting, and I thought it might be helpful for all involved if we had staff doing that for us. But if the pleasure of this board is to have Ms. Schumacher do that, I am supportive of that.
Could we have both?
I'm not sure you need both, but
Madam Chair.
Discrepancies in the minutes, I mean, we've had minutes discrepancies before, I just, if you had to, you could.
but if you have a recording, which I think they all ought to be recorded,
Yeah.
and then you have the person preparing the minutes, if there's a discrepancy, you should be able to go back to the recording.
But are we recording?
I think we are today, aren't we?
I don't know.
Mr. Shepherd?
My suggestion
Yeah,
was
we're
that we
being recorded
discuss.
today, but I think it's the first time.
Right.
Because we really don't have.
I think it's a good
one.
practice for there to be a recording of the meeting and to have staff prepare minutes. But
Madam Chair, I would
Yes.
also agree that we should have staff that takes the minutes. Well, if Ms. Schumacher's name comes up, I'll certainly vote for Ms. Schumacher. Have no problem at all with her doing this, but again, my experience has been on boards that a staff member takes the minutes.
Tom, would that be possible?
Madam Chair, I think that we have staff that are actually pretty good at doing that. And in the process, when we have done this in the past, I mean, the minutes go back to the secretary for their perusal or editing, however you want to say it, and then come back to the full board. So I think we can accommodate that.
Madam Chair, I'd like to make a comment.
Yes, ma'am.
I fully support having the secretary be a member of the board. If a member of staff wishes to take minutes as well, I think that's fine. And if there are discrepancies, I think that they could maybe talk to one another. But I feel more comfortable having our secretary be a member of the board. Thank you.
Madam Secretary, Chair.
Yes.
Madam Secretary.
I'll answer anything.
truth is, you're the chair
Okay,
now.
yeah, right.
I know. Yeah,
I'm a
you're the
little
chair.
confused.
Yeah, I'd like to also say that I think it needs to be a board member. I think that it helps to have someone who is intricately involved with the business that we're doing. And I'm not saying that a person from staff doesn't understand the library. I'm just saying there's a lot of things involved in what we do that I think needs to be a board member who is recording it.
Okay. Well, let's vote on Christie.
Madam Chair, whichever
Yes.
one it is, I believe there's a motion on the board, on the floor
It's
I know,
still,
yeah.
which I figure right now.
for Ms. Schumacher.
Christie's been nominated and it's been second.
Yes.
John has brought up having a staff member.
There was no motion, that was
That was
a
just
discussion point.
a, okay, okay. All right, let's vote on the motion for Christie being secretary. All in favor?
Aye.
All against? Great. Congratulations, Christie. Barb can hand over her magic pencil to you. Okay, moving right along since we're running really behind. We'll go to new business. First thing was the,
I'm sorry,
Committees?
yes,
Pardon me, we didn't do committee appointments. That was
Oh,
the second
shoot.
item on the old business.
yeah, okay, all right. The committee appointments were also, the committee appointments that I'm going to appoint are Executive Committee Barbara Young, Personnel Ryan Martin, Finance John Edwards.
Those were the recommendations of the
Personnel
Personnel
Committee,
Committee
yes.
to be the chairs of each of those committees.
Right,
We do need to flesh out who are going to be the members of each of those committees,
okay.
which is probably, based on what we've had so far today, going to be a very cumbersome process.
Yeah,
Um,
well, Mary
I
has,
never thought we would have started a meeting at 10 in the morning, and we're still going at 1:20 in the afternoon. My suggestion would be perhaps we act on who the chairs are
Okay,
and ask the chairs to discuss who maybe approach people on the board
okay.
that would be interested in being part of the committee and have them bring those recommendations back to the board for approval.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay. Point of order,
No, it's not up to you and me, it's up to the group.
point of order. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't Barbara the chair now? Do we
She
not
is.
address her as the chair, correct? Okay, I just want to make sure I've got it straight, because I'm no genius on Robert's rules, but, so,
Barbara's the chair.
I apologize, but I could not hear you talking about committee assignments down there.
Barbara's the chair. You are
Right.
correct. Barbara's
The Personnel Committee, at our last meeting, which I believe was June at this point, made recommendations for the chairs of the three committees, I believe. Executive Committee, Personnel, and Finance. My suggestion is that we act on who those chairs are today. At some point, we need to take the time as a board to appoint the other members of those committees. I don't see us getting that done today.
No.
So my suggestion was that appoint the chairs, whether it's accepting the recommendations or whoever has been discussed apparently in a private meeting about being chairs, as those chairs, and then have those chairs approach folks, which I understand traditionally is a person from each locality to sit on each committee, with the chair being ex officio on those committees. Come back at the next month with a recommendation for each committee for the board to act on.
Gotcha, thank you.
Madam Chair, I have a question about this. So I understand it's a suggestion and not a motion, Mr. Edwards, correct?
I can put that in a form of a motion, but I had it out there for discussion.
Okay, so I would like to see part of that process be that we actually give more definition to these committees and what their roles are, so that board members who are being asked know what the expectations are of those committees. And I would like some clarification about whether, are we trying to appoint one member from each locality to each of those committees? Is that how it's been done historically?
That's my understanding historically, but I've
Okay.
only served for a year, so.
Perhaps we delay the entire
I
conversation.
guess we can.
I'll make a motion to delay any appointment of committees so that we have time to define what the committees are, what those roles and responsibilities will be, and bring that up at the next meeting.
So we said,
I'll second.
okay, all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, so we're holding off the appointment of committee chairmans and members and definition of the committee until next month.
It's not the United States.
Okay. Library Association membership, new business.
I was asked to have that on the agenda by one of the trustees, so I presume that they would like to speak to the issue.
Yes, this is my
Okay,
point.
Kristen.
Mr. Shepley, I would like to know if you could tell us what has been PRL's procedure up until this point for trustee members and library association memberships.
Happy to do that. I think it'd be easier to hear me and have my voice being amplified. So historically, Pamunkey Regional Library.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, if this is going to turn into a long debate, which it could, I would suggest we've already gone an hour over. And I had to sacrifice pretty important appointments to be here today. I'd imagine, I would suggest that we close the meeting and pick this up next month.
Chair.
All right.
to make a motion?
I think if, would you like to make a motion to do that?
I can make a motion.
All right, that would be an amendment to the motion on the floor.
There's nothing on the
There's
floor.
nothing on the floor yet, okay, okay. You want to make that motion?
Yes, I'll make a motion that due to the time restraints that many of us have on the board, and the meeting has run over an hour over, that we adjourn today and pick up the remaining items at our next meeting in September.
Second.
Point of discussion, if we do delay this until the next meeting, I would like to assure that no new library association memberships will be filed by PRL for any new trustees or renewed for any present trustees.
I'll take that as an amendment to my motion.
Thank you.
That's fair.
Okay, the motion is on the floor and amended that due to the time constraints that we table, or not table, but delay the discussion about the organizations until next month and adjourn the meeting, and the amendment to that is that no new members be, have membership purchased for them between now and the time of the discussion,
And existing members' renewals.
and existing members' renewals, okay. Okay. Any other discussion? All in favor of the motion?
Aye.
All opposed? Motion is passed. All
I
right,
am late for a meeting.
that's our adjournment.
Guys, thank you.
Good seeing you.
So no report of the letter.
There's no way I'm gonna do that.
I had to text my guys and say I'm late. Be there as soon as I can. Sorry, guys.
Totally,
I'll see you. Take care.
totally solid.